A dark Victorian mystery. There is a particular kind of night that belongs only to London in the depths of winter, when the fog thins just enough to let a hard, clear cold settle in behind it, and the stars show sharp and close above the chimney pots, and every breath you take outdoors turns to a small white ghost before your face. It is on such a night that I ask you to join me now. Picture, if you will, the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire is banked high against the cold, throwing long shadows across the worn Persian rug, across the walls lined with books that have never quite been dusted to Mrs. Hudson's satisfaction, across the violin resting untouched in its case in the corner. Somewhere below, a kettle sings faintly upon the stove, and the smell of hot toddy, brandy and lemon and a little honey, the very thing for a night such as this, drifts up the stairwell to greet you before you have even settled into your chair. You are welcome here. You have always been welcome here. Settle back now. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the cares of your own evening fall away, and let the cares of ours take their place instead. Small, contained, comfortable cares, the kind that belong entirely to a story and not at all to you. If you like, close your eyes and simply listen. You need not follow every word to follow the shape of what I am about to tell you. You need only let it carry you, slow and steady, the way deep water carries a stone that has long since stopped struggling and simply allowed itself to sink. My name is John Watson, and before I let sleep take you fully into its keeping, I want to tell you of a winter some years past. A winter that began with a length of fresh snow, and a set of footprints, and a mystery so strange that even Sherlock Holmes, upon first hearing it described, called it the most impossible set of facts ever laid before him in the whole of his career. A man walked out across a frozen lake one bitter Christmas Eve, and he did not walk back. His footprints went on, clear and unbroken in the new fallen snow, straight out toward the center of that lake, and there, without warning, without a hole broken in the ice, without any sign of struggle or fall or flight, they simply stopped, as if the man himself had stepped, mid-stride, out of the world entirely. Let yourself grow comfortable now, in the warmth of this fire, in the safety of these four walls. And let me tell you what we found beneath the ice at Thornfield Grange. Thornfield Grange. The estate lay some 40 miles north of London, in a fold of quiet Hertfordshire countryside, where the roads grew narrower and the hedgerows taller the further one travelled from the railway, until at last the carriage turned through a pair of iron gates gone soft with rust and climbed a long gravel drive toward a house that seemed, even at first glance, to have been built by a family more concerned with permanence than with warmth. Thornfield Grange had belonged to the Carrow family for 4 generations, and its present master, Sir Edmund Carrow, had spent the greater part of his own long life adding to its severe reputation rather than softening it. He had sat for over 20 years as a judge of the criminal courts, a man renowned and, in certain quarters, quietly feared for the coldness of his reasoning and the harshness of his sentences. He had retired from the bench some 3 years before the events I am about to relate, citing his health, and had withdrawn to Thornfield to live out what the county newspapers had described, at the time, as a well-earned and peaceful retirement among the gardens and waters he loved best. Chief among those waters was the lake. It lay behind the house, at the bottom of a long sloping lawn, ringed by ancient willows, whose bare branches in winter hung low and skeletal over the ice. And it was, by every account I gathered in the days that followed, a lake with rather more history to it than its placid summer appearance ever suggested. The local people spoke of it in the particular half-embarrassed manner of country folk discussing a superstition they do not quite believe and cannot quite dismiss, as a place that had claimed more than one life across the generations. A governess, some 60 years before Sir Edmund's own tenancy, who had drowned there attempting to skate too far from shore. A stable boy, further back still, whose body had never been recovered at all, and whose ghost, it was said by the older villagers, could sometimes be glimpsed of a winter's evening, standing at the water's frozen edge, waiting for something that never came. Sir Edmund himself had never seemed troubled by these stories. Indeed, he had made the lake something of a private passion in his retirement, skating upon it himself each winter with the same brisk, joyless discipline he had once brought to his courtroom, and walking its frozen surface most mornings, weather permitting, as a form of exercise his physician had recommended for a heart he was rumoured, though never confirmed, to have been nursing some private weakness in for a number of years. He had one child, a daughter named Helena, some 26 years of age, who had kept his house since her mother's death many years before, and who was, by every account, both devoted to her father and, as I would soon come to learn in far greater and more painful detail, deeply, quietly afraid of him in a manner she had never once permitted herself to name aloud, even to herself. It was Helena Carrow who summoned us to Thornfield in the second week of January, some 3 weeks after her father had walked out onto the frozen lake on Christmas Eve and vanished from the face of the earth. The lake itself, I should say, before proceeding further with the strange particulars of that vanishing, deserved rather more careful description than the simple fact of its frozen surface conveys. It was not a small ornamental pond of the kind one finds behind many a country house, but a genuine sheet of water some 400 yards across at its widest point, fed by an underground spring that kept it, even in the mildest winters, reliably frozen from the second week of December through to the middle of February, a natural phenomenon the local farmers had long relied upon for their own modest ice harvest, and which had given the ancient ice house at its far edge, now fallen into disuse, its original and once entirely practical purpose. The willows that ringed its banks had stood, by the estimate of the oldest villagers, for well over a century, their roots grown thick and gnarled into the very soil of the lake's edge, their bare winter branches hanging low enough over certain stretches of shore to create, in places, a kind of natural tunnel between the open water and the surrounding parkland, a detail that would prove, in time, rather more significant to our investigation than I could have possibly appreciated on that first cold afternoon of our arrival. 2. The vanishing her letter, which I have kept among my papers, was written in a hand that grew visibly less steady toward its close, as though the effort of composing it had cost her a great deal more than the mere physical labor of holding a pen. "Dear Mr. Holmes," it read, "I write to you not because I believe my father is dead, but because I do not believe it, and no one else in this county will permit me to say so aloud. The official verdict, delivered without a body ever being found, is that he walked out onto the lake on Christmas Eve, that the ice gave way beneath him at some point beyond where his footprints end, and that his body has been carried by some undercurrent to a part of the lake too deep for our local men to drag. I have been told this by the coroner, by our family solicitor, by the vicar, and by nearly every soul in this village, and I confess I no longer have the strength to argue against so unanimous a chorus. But I have walked that lake myself, Mr. Holmes, in the weeks since his disappearance, and I have looked at where those footprints end, and I cannot make myself believe that a man simply vanishes from the middle of solid ice without leaving so much as a crack behind him. I do not know what happened to my father. I do not know whether I even wish to know, given some of the things I have since learned about him. But I cannot go on living in this house, on the edge of this lake, without someone competent enough to tell me the truth of it, whatever that truth may prove to be. Holmes read the letter twice through, in the particular silence he reserved for correspondence that interested him rather more than he generally cared to admit at first reading, and then set it down upon the table between us, with a small, thoughtful frown. There is a phrase in this letter, Watson, that I find considerably more interesting than the vanishing itself. Which phrase? Given some of the things I have since learned about him. A grieving daughter, uncertain whether her father is alive or dead, does not generally trouble herself to qualify her grief with such a phrase, unless something rather significant has come to light in the interval, something that has complicated, rather than simplified, her feelings toward the man she is trying so hard to believe still living. I think, Watson, that we had better go to Hertfordshire and find out precisely what Miss Carrow has learned. We departed the following morning, and I confess that the case, even before we had left London, had already begun to exercise upon my imagination the particular fascination that only a genuinely impossible fact can produce. For I had read a great deal, in my years beside Holmes, of clever murders and cleverer thefts, but I had never once encountered a mystery in which the central fact defied not merely explanation, but the ordinary physical laws by which the world is generally understood to operate at all. A man does not simply stop existing in the middle of solid ice, and yet, by every account that reached us, that was precisely what Sir Edmund Carrow appeared to have done. What the village believed. We arrived at the small market town nearest Thornfield on a bitter afternoon, the sky the colour of old pewter, the fields on either side of the road lying white and silent beneath a fortnight's accumulated snow, and I will confess that the atmosphere of the place, quiet, watchful, and just faintly uneasy, settled over me rather more heavily than I had expected, even before we had set eyes upon the lake itself. We took rooms at the local inn, the Carrow Arms, whose landlord, a broad, garrulous man named Beckett, proved only too willing to share the full weight of local opinion once he had satisfied himself that Holmes's card carried the reputation he had heard rumoured in the London papers. "The lakes took him, sir, same as it took the governess and the stable boy before him, and no amount of London reasoning is going to change what every soul in this village has known for generations," Beckett said, drawing our pints with the particular relish of a man delivering a favourite and well-practised story. "There's something in that water that doesn't like to give back what it takes. My own grandfather used to say, the lake keeps a ledger of its own, same as any judge, and settles its accounts in its own good time." "A poetic notion," Holmes observed dryly, "though I confess I have generally found ledgers, whether kept by lakes or by judges, to be rather more susceptible to human arithmetic than local legend generally allows." "You can say that in London, sir, where you've no lake of your own to argue with you," Beckett replied, entirely unoffended. "But I'll tell you this for nothing. There's been a stranger seen about the village these past 2 months, before the old judge ever went missing, asking odd questions in the taverns about Sir Edmund's old cases, and not a soul here has seen hide nor hair of him since the very week the judge disappeared. Make of that whatever your London reasoning cares to make of it." Holmes's eyes sharpened at this, though his tone remained carefully idle. A stranger, you say? Can you describe him? A young man, dark-haired, foreign-looking about the eyes, though he spoke plain enough English, asking after old court records, old cases, anything to do with the judge's years on the bench. Gave his name as Mr. Vane, though I'd wager a week's takings that wasn't his true name at all. He stopped taking his rooms here the very morning after Sir Edmund vanished, and left without so much as settling his final week's bill, which I've always found tells you a great deal about a man's character, whatever fine manners he shows you across a supper table. I saw Holmes file this small fact away with evident care, though he pursued it no further that evening, and it was not until we had retired to our own rooms that he permitted himself to speak of it at greater length. A stranger investigating old cases, vanishing the very morning the judge himself vanished, he mused, settling into the room's one comfortable chair with his pipe already lit. The village, predictably, has already convicted him in its collective imagination, a foreign avenger come to settle some old grievance, driving the judge into the lake, or worse, and fleeing before justice could catch him. It is, I grant you, a tidier story than an impossible vanishing amid solid ice, and I have long observed that villages, like newspapers, greatly prefer a tidy story to an accurate one. You don't believe he's responsible? I believe, Watson, that I have not yet examined a single fact of this case with my own eyes, and I make it an absolute rule never to convict a man, even in the privacy of my own reasoning, before I have walked the ground myself. Tomorrow, weather permitting, I should very much like to see this remarkable lake for myself. 3b. The governess's ghost. I ought to record a little more of the lake's older legend here, for it occupied a considerable portion of our first evening's conversation at the Carrow Arms, and I believe it illuminates something of the particular atmosphere of dread that had settled over the whole village even before Sir Edmund's own disappearance gave that dread its most recent and most dramatic expression. The governess, Beckett had mentioned, a Miss Alice Fenwick, no relation, so far as anyone could determine, to any family of our previous acquaintance, had served the Carrow family some 60 years prior to the events I am now describing, in the household of Sir Edmund's own grandfather, and had drowned, by the account passed down through 3 generations of village storytelling, while skating alone upon the lake one particularly cold December evening, her body recovered only after several days' searching, frozen and pale, beneath a thin new layer of ice that had formed, undisturbed, directly above her. They say she still walks the shore of an evening, sir, Beckett told us, lowering his voice to the particular hushed register country folk reserve for their most cherished ghost stories, searching for the skate she lost when she went under. A single silver skate, never recovered, that some say still lies at the bottom of that lake to this very day, waiting for her to find it before her spirit can finally rest easy. Holmes received this account with his customary dry skepticism, though I noted he asked, with rather more genuine interest than his tone suggested, whether anyone still living claimed to have actually witnessed this apparition. My own grandmother swore she saw her, sir, as a girl, walking the far shore one winter's evening, with a lantern in her hand, searching the ice for something she never found. I'll not say I believe it myself, mind, being a practical man in the ordinary way of things. But I'll not walk that shore alone after dark either, whatever my practical nature tells me about ghosts and their general non-existence. I found myself struck, hearing this, by the peculiar way in which old legends and present mysteries seem to accumulate around certain places, each new strange occurrence borrowing some of its dread from the stories that came before it, until a lake that had, in all likelihood, claimed only a single unfortunate governess through nothing more sinister than an ordinary skating accident 60 years before, had become, in the local imagination, a place of accumulated and multiplying menace, ready-made, as it were, to absorb whatever new mystery might arrive, to darken its reputation further. "It is a useful thing to remember, Watson," Holmes told me later that evening, "that a place's reputation, once established, tends to attract new mysteries to itself, rather like a magnet attracts iron filings, not because the place itself possesses any genuine supernatural property, but because human beings, faced with something they cannot immediately explain, will very often reach first for whatever explanatory framework already lies most readily to hand. A lake already reputed to claim lives will always find itself blamed rather than examined when a new death or disappearance occurs upon its shores. I intend, in this present case, to examine rather than blame whatever the local legend may prefer. I4. A curious indifference I expected, given the singular strangeness of the case, that Holmes would press directly to the lake itself at the very first opportunity, and I confess his behavior over the following 2 days puzzled me rather more than the mystery itself. He spent the greater part of our first full day at Thornfield, not at the lake at all, but closeted with the local newspapers, going back some 5 years, reading through them with the slow, methodical patience he generally reserved for evidence he considered genuinely significant, while making no mention whatsoever, in my hearing, of footprints or ice or the mysterious Mr. Vane. He walked, on our second morning, not down toward the lake, but up toward the village churchyard, where he spent the better part of an hour examining headstones with his lens, copying certain dates and names into his notebook with an absorption that struck me, at the time, as wholly disconnected from the case that had brought us there. "You seem determined to examine everything about this county, Holmes, save the one thing that actually concerns us," I remarked, on the evening of that second day, as we sat once more before the inn's modest fire. "On the contrary, Watson, I have concerned myself with nothing else since the moment we arrived. I have simply concluded that the lake itself, however dramatic its central mystery, will tell us considerably less than the man who walked out upon it, and I have found that a man's history, his cases, his enemies, his reputation among those who knew him longest, very often explains a great deal more about his eventual fate than the physical circumstances of that fate ever can. And what have you learned of Sir Edmund's history? That he was, by any fair measure, an exceptionally severe judge, even by the standards of an age not generally known for its gentleness toward the criminal classes. That he presided, across his 2 decades on the bench, over no fewer than 4 capital convictions, 3 of which appear, upon the plainest reading of the newspaper accounts, to have rested upon evidence rather thinner than a man's life ought reasonably to hang upon. And that one case in particular, a conviction some 21 years past, of a young man named Michael Weathers, tried for the murder of a moneylender in circumstances that struck even the newspaper of the day as somewhat irregular, appears to have been quietly and permanently closed from further inquiry, in a manner I find, on reflection, rather more suspicious than the newspapers of the time seem to have found it themselves. You believe this Weathers case connects to the present mystery. I believe, Watson, that a man who has spent 20 years sending other men to the gallows accumulates, across so long a career, a very great number of people who might wish him harm, and that before I trouble myself further with footprints and frozen water, I should very much like to understand precisely which of those accumulated grievances might have followed Sir Edmund home to Thornfield at last. V. The Weathers case. Holmes spent the better part of our third morning at Thornfield in the offices of the county newspaper, poring over the archived accounts of the Weathers trial with the assistance of a young clerk who seemed rather flattered to be of use to so celebrated a visitor from London. I joined him for the latter half of this research, and what emerged, pieced together from yellowing newsprint and the clerk's own half-remembered local gossip, painted a portrait considerably darker than the county's official memory of its own former judge. Michael Weathers had been but 22 years of age at the time of his trial, a clerk in the employ of a moneylender named Josiah Prentice, who had been found dead in his own offices one autumn evening, his skull crushed by a blow from a heavy paperweight, his strongbox emptied of its contents. Weathers had been the last person seen entering the premises, had fled the town within days of the murder under circumstances that certainly looked, on their face, like the flight of a guilty man, and had been apprehended some weeks later in Portsmouth, attempting to secure passage to America. The evidence against him, examined now with the benefit of 20 years' distance, struck me as considerably thinner than a man's life ought to hang upon. No witness had seen the blow struck. The stolen money was never recovered on his person. His flight, he had insisted throughout his trial, sprang not from guilt, but from sheer terror at finding himself the last visitor to a murdered man's office, and possessing no means of proving his innocence to a county already primed by Prentice's own considerable local unpopularity as a moneylender to see swift justice done to whoever could most conveniently be blamed. Sir Edmund Carrow had presided over the trial, and his summing up to the jury, reprinted in full in the newspaper's account, had been notable, even to my own untrained eye, for the severity with which it dismissed every particular of the defence, and emphasized, at considerable and repeated length, the damning weight of the young man's flight. He was hanged within 6 weeks of his conviction, Holmes said quietly, setting down the final newspaper. A remarkably swift proceeding, even by the standards of the day, and one that left precious little time for any appeal, however merited, to be properly mounted. You believe him innocent? I believe, Watson, that a case built so entirely upon circumstance and flight, and pressed towards so swift a conclusion by a judge already known for his severity, deserves considerably more scrutiny than it appears to have received at the time. And I believe, further, that a young man named Vane, asking pointed questions about Sir Edmund's old cases in this very village, not 2 months before the judge's disappearance, may have arrived at a rather similar conclusion a good deal earlier than I have. You think Vane is connected to Weathers somehow? I think it worth remembering, Watson, that Michael Weathers left behind, at the time of his execution, a young wife, some months pregnant with his child, a fact the newspapers of the day mention only in a single sorrowful sentence before moving on to more sensational matters. A child born into that particular grief, raised on the story of a father hanged for a crime the family never believed he committed, might grow, 20 years later, into precisely the sort of young man who comes quietly to a village asking careful questions about old court records, and who vanishes again the very morning his father's judge disappears from the face of the earth. Vic's Eye, the lake at last. It was on our 4th day at Thornfield that Holmes finally consented to examine the lake itself, and I confess I had begun, by that point, to wonder whether he intended to solve the entire case from newspaper archives alone, without ever once setting foot upon the ice. We were received at the Grange by Helena Carrow herself, a tall, pale young woman, with her father's sharp, watchful eyes set into a face that grief had worn thin and fragile in the weeks since his disappearance. She wore black, as convention demanded, though I noted, watching her closely, that her mourning seemed to carry within it some further and more complicated weight than simple sorrow alone could account for. The same qualified grief, I thought, that had coloured her letter to us in London. "I had begun to think you would not come at all, Mr. Holmes," she said, leading us through the great cold hall of the house and out toward the lawn beyond. "The coroner has all but closed the matter. My father's solicitor speaks already of probate, of settling the estate, as though the question of what actually happened to him were merely an inconvenient formality standing between myself and my inheritance. I have begun to feel rather alone in my conviction that something is genuinely wrong here, beyond the plain fact of my father's disappearance." "You are not alone in it any longer, Miss Carrow," Holmes said, with a gentleness I had come to recognize as entirely genuine, whatever brisk indifference he showed the world at large. "I have read a great deal about your father these past 3 days, and I confess I share your conviction that the truth of this matter is considerably more complicated than a simple accident upon the ice. The lake, when we reached it, lay exactly as I had imagined it from her letter and from Beckett's colourful account. A broad sheet of grey-white ice, ringed by the bare, skeletal willows, silent and perfectly still beneath a sky the colour of old iron, and there, preserved beneath a light fall of fresh snow that had settled over them without quite obscuring their shape, ran the footprints. They began at the small boathouse near the lake's edge, clear and evenly spaced, the mark of a man walking at an ordinary, unhurried pace directly out across the ice. They continued, straight and true, for perhaps 60 or 70 yards toward the lake's centre, and there, with no warning whatsoever, they simply stopped. There was no hole in the ice. There was no scattered or broken pattern suggesting a struggle, a fall, a sudden flight in any direction. There was no second set of prints returning toward the shore. There was only a single, final, ordinary footprint, the mark of a man's boot pressed into the snow exactly as every footprint before it had been pressed, and then nothing at all, as though the very ground itself had simply ceased to exist beneath him at that one particular point, and resumed existing, untouched and unmarked, in every direction beyond it. I have examined, in the course of my years beside Sherlock Holmes, a great many strange and troubling sights. I do not believe I have ever felt quite the particular chill that settled over me, standing at the edge of that frozen lake, looking at a trail of footprints that led, with perfect ordinary confidence, directly into nothing at all. Holmes, beside me, said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Well, Watson, I begin to understand why the village prefers its ghost story to the truth. A ghost, after all, requires no explanation at all. This," and he gestured toward the abrupt, impossible terminus of those tracks, "requires rather a great deal of explanation, and I intend to have every particle of it before I leave this county. V's eyes be, a motherless house." I ought to say something here, before proceeding further with the mechanics of our investigation, of Helena Carrow herself, and of the peculiar loneliness that had shaped her whole life long before her father's disappearance ever gave that loneliness its final and most terrible expression. Her mother, I learned across several quiet conversations over the following days, had died when Helena was but 7 years old, a lingering illness that Sir Edmund, by every account, had borne with the same cold and disciplined severity he brought to every other trial of his life, refusing to permit any outward display of grief either in himself or in his young daughter, whom he had instructed, on the very morning of the funeral, to bear this loss as befits a Carrow, without tears that accomplish nothing beyond their own indulgence. "I did not cry at my mother's funeral, Mr. Holmes," Helena told us, some days into our investigation, with the particular flat composure of a woman describing a wound so old it has long since stopped actively bleeding, though it has never once fully healed either. I did not cry, in fact, for the better part of a year afterward, having somehow absorbed, from that single instruction, the belief that grief itself was a kind of moral failing my father would not forgive in me. I cried, at last, alone in the stables one autumn evening, over nothing more significant than a pony I had grown fond of going lame, and I remember feeling, even then, a considerable guilt at having finally permitted myself so much feeling over so small a loss, when I had denied myself any feeling at all over so much greater a one. She had been raised, in the years that followed, by a succession of governesses whose own tenure at Thornfield rarely extended beyond a year or two, for Sir Edmund's exacting standards regarding his daughter's education and deportment proved as difficult for hired staff to satisfy as his exacting standards had once proven for the criminals who came before his bench. She had grown, by her own rueful account, into precisely the kind of watchful, self-contained young woman such an upbringing was calculated to produce, competent, composed, and privately starved for exactly the kind of warm and uncomplicated affection her father had never once shown himself capable of providing. "I do not tell you this to excuse him, Mr. Holmes," she said, "nor even, I think, to explain him fully, for I do not believe a difficult childhood alone accounts for the particular cruelty of what he did to Mr. Weathers and his family. I tell you only because I have spent a great deal of these past weeks trying to understand how the father I knew, cold, certainly, and difficult to love, but never, so far as I ever witnessed, actively cruel to me personally, could also have been a man capable of sending an innocent young man to the gallows for money. I have not yet found an answer that satisfies me. I am not certain such an answer exists." Holmes listened to this account with the particular grave attention he reserved for testimony that illuminated character rather than mere fact, and I saw, in the careful gentleness of his response, that he had come to regard Helena Carrow with a genuine sympathy that extended well beyond the ordinary courtesy he showed his clients. "I do not believe, Miss Carrow, that any answer exists which could fully reconcile the two portraits of your father you have been forced to hold simultaneously these past weeks. I have found, across a long career studying men who commit terrible crimes, that very few of them are simply monsters through and through. Most are, instead, ordinary men who made one catastrophic choice at some particular moment of weakness or temptation, and then spent the whole of their remaining lives constructing whatever comfortable fictions were necessary to continue living alongside that choice. Your father's coldness toward you, I suspect, was never a mask for cruelty specifically directed at you. It was, I think, simply the cost of a man who had already decided, long before you were even born, that feeling too much was a danger he could not afford to indulge in, a decision that protected him, perhaps, from ever fully confronting what he had done to Michael Weathers, at the terrible cost of never fully offering you the warmth you so plainly deserved. 6c. The first winter of the vanishing, I have described already the general shape of the village's belief in the weeks following Sir Edmund's disappearance, but I believe it worth setting down in rather more particular detail how that first bewildering month actually unfolded for Helena herself, before Holmes and I ever arrived to offer her the comfort of a proper investigation. She had spent Christmas morning, she told us, in a state of mounting confusion rather than immediate alarm, assuming at first that her father had simply risen early for his customary walk and lost track of the hour, as he had occasionally done before in his more absorbed and solitary moods. It was only when noon arrived without any sign of him, and Cutler's own search of the house and immediate grounds turned up nothing, that genuine fear began to take hold, and it was Cutler himself, following the fresh snow down toward the lake on a hunch he could not afterward fully explain, who first discovered the terrible trail of footprints ending so abruptly upon the ice. I remember standing at that shore, Mr. Holmes, on Christmas morning of all mornings, watching the search party the village had hastily assembled, dragging the lake with grappling hooks and long poles, and thinking that surely, some mistake would soon be discovered, that my father would come striding up from the village, wondering what all the fuss concerned, and the whole dreadful morning would resolve itself into nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. Helena's voice, recounting this, had taken on the particular flat quality of a memory revisited too many times already, worn smooth by repetition rather than genuinely dulled by the passage of time. That mistake was never discovered, Mr. Holmes. The search continued through Boxing Day and into the week following, growing steadily less hopeful and steadily more ceremonial in character, until at last the coroner arrived at his own comfortable conclusion, and the whole county simply agreed, by a kind of unspoken and exhausted consensus, to stop searching and begin grieving instead. I asked her, gently, how she had managed those first weeks of official mourning, conducted for a father she was not yet certain deserved to be mourned as an innocent victim of misfortune. I performed the grief the world expected of me, Doctor, because I did not yet know what else to perform in its place. I wore black. I received condolence calls. I thanked the vicar for his kind words at the memorial service we held, in the absence of any body to properly bury. And beneath all of it, every single day, I carried this small, stubborn, unexplainable conviction that something was simply wrong with the whole accepted story, a conviction I could not defend to anyone, least of all to myself, and which I very nearly abandoned entirely, on more than one exhausted evening, before I finally found the courage to write to Mr. Holmes instead. I have come to believe, reflecting upon this account in the years since, that Helena Carrow's particular courage, in this case, did not lie merely in her eventual discovery of her father's letters, nor in her composed reception of his subsequent confession. It lay, rather, in this earlier and less dramatic act of simple, sustained honesty with herself, the refusal, sustained across 3 lonely weeks of performed grief and private doubt, to abandon a true instinct simply because the whole weight of official opinion stood arrayed against it. 7. What the ice could not explain, Holmes's examination of the lake that afternoon proceeded with a thoroughness I had come to expect of him, and I will set down here only the 2 conclusions that mattered most of the very great many small observations he made and recorded in his notebook over the course of some 3 hours upon that frozen surface. The first concerned the ice itself. Holmes had brought with him, from London, a small auger of his own devising, and he used it to bore a series of test holes at intervals across the lake, near the shore, at the midpoint where the footprints ran, and at the very spot where they came to their impossible end. "Observe, Watson," he said, drawing up a core of ice from that final, fateful point, and holding it to the pale winter light. 4 inches of solid ice, uniform in thickness with every other sample I have drawn from this lake today. There is no thinning here, no weakness, no point at which a man's weight might plausibly have broken through. Whatever happened to Sir Edmund Carrow at this spot, Watson, it was not the ice giving way beneath him. 4 inches of clean, cold-formed ice would bear the weight of a loaded farm cart, let alone one elderly gentleman upon his morning walk. Then he did not fall through at all. He did not fall through at all. And I believe the coroner's verdict, however comfortably it has settled the matter for the county at large, rests upon an assumption no one troubled to actually test before pronouncing it. He set down the ice core and turned his attention, instead, to the footprints themselves, examining them now with his lens, crouched low over the snow with the particular fierce concentration I had learned, over many years, never to interrupt. It was some 20 minutes before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried a note of genuine and rather startled admiration that I had rarely heard him extend to a mystery not yet fully solved. "There is a very great deal of skill in this, Watson. Observe the depth and spacing of these final dozen prints, as compared with those nearer the shore." I looked, though I confess I could see little beyond what appeared, to my own untrained eye, to be a perfectly ordinary and consistent set of footprints. "They are identical," I said. "Surely, which is precisely what troubles us. They are almost identical, Watson, and it is the almost that interests me a very great deal. Observe here." He indicated a print some 10 yards from the final one, "and compare it with this one, nearer the terminus. The depth of the heel impression, relative to the toe, is very slightly greater in the later prints. Not greatly, not so much as a casual observer, or even a careful one not specifically looking for it, would ever trouble to notice, but present and consistent across every one of the final dozen or so prints in this trail. What does it signify? It signifies, I believe, a man walking backward, Watson, his own weight shifted forward onto his heels rather than his toes, precisely as one's weight naturally shifts when one walks in reverse rather than forward, however carefully one attempts to disguise the difference by placing each foot exactly within an existing print. It is a very difficult thing to do convincingly, and our friend has done it about as well as such a thing can be done. But he has not done it perfectly, and 4 inches of packed snow, examined by a sufficiently patient eye, does not lie. I stared at him, and then at the footprints, turning the extraordinary implication of what he had just said over in my mind. "You are suggesting that whoever made these tracks did not walk out onto this lake and vanish at all. You are suggesting he walked out and then walked back again, retracing his own steps precisely, backward, so that the trail would appear, to any observer, to end at the point where he actually turned around, rather than continuing back to shore where he truly went. I am suggesting precisely that, Watson, and I believe further that a man capable of executing so careful and so patient a deception, in temperatures cold enough to number among the more miserable mornings of an English winter, was not fleeing from anyone in a moment of sudden panic. He was executing a plan, prepared and rehearsed well in advance, by a mind every bit as cold and as calculating as the ice he walked upon. 7b. A lesson in snow. I confess, I found myself, in the days that followed, turning Holmes's reasoning about the footprints over in my mind with a persistence that surprised even myself. For it seemed to me, the longer I considered it, one of the most genuinely remarkable pieces of deduction I had witnessed in the whole of our long association together. Remarkable not for any single dramatic insight, but for the sheer patience of eye required to notice so subtle a variation across a dozen nearly identical impressions in ordinary snow. I said as much to Holmes that evening, over a modest supper at the Carrow Arms, and he received the compliment with rather more genuine pleasure than he generally permitted himself to show at my occasional praise. "You flatter the observation rather more than it deserves, Watson, for the truth of the matter is considerably less mysterious than it may appear. I have made a particular study, across many years, of the mechanics of the human gait, how a man's weight distributes itself differently, walking uphill than down, running than walking, carrying a burden than walking unencumbered, and yes, walking backward than walking forward. It is not so very different, in principle, from a physician's trained eye recognizing at a glance the particular gait of a man suffering from gout, or from an old injury to the hip, long before that man has said a single word about his own condition. The information is present in the ordinary world all around us, Watson, in 1,000 small physical details that most people never trouble themselves to examine with any real attention. I have simply spent a great many years training my own eye to look for precisely such details, and the training, once thoroughly absorbed, makes what appears to the untrained observer as a kind of magic trick into nothing more mysterious than a rather tedious exercise in careful measurement. You make it sound almost mechanical, Holmes, when I confess the effect upon me, standing at that lake's edge, was rather closer to genuine awe. I do not object to awe, Watson, provided it does not curdle into superstition. The village believes that lake keeps some manner of supernatural ledger, settling its accounts according to some dark and ancient logic beyond human understanding. I believe, rather, that the lake is simply frozen water, obedient to the same physical laws that govern all frozen water everywhere, and that whatever mystery it appeared to contain was never a mystery of the lake at all, but a mystery of one particular man's very human cunning, applied with unusual skill to those same unchanging physical laws. I find that explanation considerably more awe-inspiring than any ghost story, if I am honest with you, Watson, for it requires no departure whatsoever from the ordinary rules of the world we both already understand, only a rather more careful application of attention than most of us trouble to bring to that world in the ordinary course of our days. I have thought of that small exchange often, in the years since, whenever I have found myself tempted, by some particularly strange or troubling circumstance, to reach too quickly for a supernatural or otherwise inexplicable explanation, rather than continuing to search, patiently and carefully, for whatever entirely ordinary mechanism might account for it instead. It remains, I think, among the truest lessons Holmes ever taught me, quite apart from any particular case, that the world very rarely requires magic to explain its strangest appearances, provided one is willing to look closely enough and patiently enough at the evidence actually before one's eyes. V. A question of distance. There remained, however, one considerable difficulty in Holmes's theory, which he acknowledged himself before I had even the chance to raise it. If he walked backward to shore, retracing his own steps, I said, then he ought to have arrived, in the end, precisely back at the boathouse from which he began, and yet no one has seen him since, nor found any trace of him beyond this lake, in the whole of 3 weeks' searching. Precisely the difficulty that has occupied my thoughts for the better part of this examination, Watson, and I believe I have found its answer, though I confess it required rather more careful looking than the footprints alone provided. Holmes rose from his crouch and gestured toward the lake's edge, some considerable distance from the boathouse itself, where a dense stand of frozen reeds and overhanging willow branches created a natural screen along a stretch of shoreline perhaps 40 yards distant from where the outward trail had originally begun. Observe the angle of these backward-walking prints as they near the shore, Watson. They do not return precisely to the boathouse at all. They curve, very gradually, very subtly, a degree or two of divergence with each step, scarcely perceptible unless one is specifically measuring for it, toward that stand of reeds instead. A man walking backward, placing his feet with great care into his own existing prints, would find it exceedingly difficult to maintain a perfectly straight line without some visual reference to guide him. I believe our friend permitted himself a small, calculated drift toward a point of concealment he had chosen well in advance, precisely because he intended to leave the ice at a location screened from the house, rather than returning to the boathouse, where a groundskeeper or early rising servant might more easily have observed him. We walked the length of the shore to that stand of reeds ourselves, and found there, preserved in a patch of snow more sheltered from the wind than the open ice had been, a scattering of marks Holmes identified, after some minutes of careful study, as the tracks of a man stepping from ice onto solid ground, and then, most tellingly of all, a faint but unmistakable indentation suggesting where a second pair of boots, considerably smaller than Sir Edmund's own, had stood waiting. "He did not walk away from this lake alone, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "Someone met him here, at this precise and carefully chosen point, and whatever became of Sir Edmund Carrow after that meeting, I do not believe it occurred upon this ice at all." V.B. What Holmes told Helena. That first evening, before I proceed to the fuller shape of Helena's own family history, I ought to record a little more of that first substantial conversation Holmes conducted with her on the evening following our initial examination of the lake, for it established, I think, the particular tone of trust between detective and client that would sustain the whole of our investigation through its many difficult turns. "I must ask you a question, Miss Carrow, that I suspect you have already asked yourself a great many times in these past 3 weeks, and which I would nonetheless like to hear answered in your own words, that I might properly gauge your own settled conviction on the matter," Holmes said, once the ordinary courtesies of tea had been observed. "Do you believe in your own heart that your father is dead?" She considered the question with a gravity that told me, watching her, precisely how many sleepless nights had already been spent turning it over in private. "I do not know what I believe, Mr. Holmes, and I have come to distrust my own instincts on the matter, precisely because I cannot separate what I genuinely believe from what I desperately wish to believe. There are mornings I wake certain he is dead, drowned exactly as the coroner insists, and I grieve him as thoroughly and as simply as any daughter grieves a father lost to sudden misfortune. There are other mornings I wake equally certain he is alive, hiding somewhere for reasons I cannot yet imagine, and I find myself almost angry at him for the uncertainty he has left me to bear alone, rather than grieving him at all. I do not know which of these two states of mind represents my true belief, Mr. Holmes. I suspect, in truth, that I have simply not yet permitted myself to settle upon either one, for fear of what settling might cost me should I later prove wrong. That is, I think, a rather more honest answer than most clients manage to give me on a first consultation, Miss Carrow, and I value honesty of that particular kind a very great deal more than I value confident certainty, however comforting confident certainty might feel in the moment. I will tell you plainly that I do not yet know, myself, whether your father is alive or dead. I know only that the physical evidence at that lake does not support the explanation the coroner has settled upon, and that unsupported explanations, however comfortable, deserve to be tested rather than simply accepted. I intend to test this one thoroughly, Miss Carrow, and I will tell you the truth of whatever I find, however that truth ultimately falls between the two states of mind you have just described to me. That is all I have ever asked of anyone in this whole dreadful business, Mr. Holmes. I confess, it is rather more than anyone else has been willing to offer me thus far. I recall thinking, hearing this exchange, that Holmes's particular genius lay not merely in the celebrated sharpness of his observation, nor in the elegance of his deductive reasoning, but in this quieter and less frequently celebrated skill as well, the ability to offer a frightened and uncertain client exactly the kind of honest, unhurried respect that permitted her to speak plainly of her own confusion rather than performing a confidence she did not genuinely feel, merely to satisfy whatever expectation society generally places upon a grieving daughter's proper conduct. Helena's confession. We returned to the house as the light was failing, and Holmes, rather than pressing directly for an interview with Helena Carrow, asked instead to sit quietly with her for a while, before the fire, an unusual gentleness in his method that I had come to recognize as reserved for witnesses whose testimony he judged both essential and fragile in equal measure. You said, in your letter, that you had learned certain things about your father since his disappearance, Holmes said at last, once tea had been poured and the ordinary courtesies exhausted. I believe the time has come for you to tell us what those things were, Miss Carrow, however painful you may find the telling. She was silent for a long while, her hands very still in her lap, and when at last she spoke, her voice had the particular flatness of a woman reciting something she had rehearsed alone, late at night, many times before ever finding the courage to say it aloud to another living soul. I found, some 10 days after he vanished, a locked drawer in his study that I had never before had occasion to open. My father was a private man, Mr. Holmes, and I had learned, across many years, not to pry into whatever business he kept behind locked doors. But grief makes one bold in ways ordinary respect never would, and I broke the lock myself, with a poker from the fire, telling myself I was searching only for some clue to his whereabouts. And what did you find? Letters, Mr. Holmes. A great many letters, spanning some 20 years, from a man I have never met and whose name meant nothing to me until I began to read them. A Mr. Josiah Prentice, a moneylender, it would seem, from the correspondence itself, though I have since learned he was murdered some 21 years ago, in a case my father himself presided over as judge. Her voice had begun to shake, very slightly. The letters make plain, Mr. Holmes, that my father received a considerable sum of money from this Mr. Prentice, in the weeks before that trial, in exchange for what one letter refers to, quite openly, as ensuring the proper and swift conclusion of the Weathers matter. I did not understand, at first, what such language meant. I understand it now rather better than I wish I did. I saw Holmes absorb this confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect from the newspaper archives, though he betrayed no particular surprise, only a quiet and careful gravity. "You believe your father accepted a bribe to secure a conviction," he said gently. "A conviction that resulted, ultimately, in a young man's execution. I believe it because his own hand wrote the letters acknowledging the payment, Mr. Holmes, and I have found no way to read them that permits any gentler interpretation." She pressed one gloved hand briefly against her eyes. "I have spent 26 years believing my father a hard man, certainly, but a just one, severe in his judgments, perhaps, but never anything worse than severe. I do not know how to hold that belief any longer, alongside what I have read in his own handwriting. I do not know, Mr. Holmes, whether I am grieving a murdered man, or hunting a fugitive, or simply losing what remained of a father I never truly knew at all. That is what I meant, in my letter, by the things I have since learned about him. I am sorry I did not say it more plainly at the time. I did not yet have the courage to write it in full." Holmes was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth I had not always heard him extend, even to clients he genuinely liked. "You have shown a very great deal of courage already, Miss Carrow, in bringing these letters to light at all, when silence would certainly have proven the more comfortable course. I believe, moreover, that these letters explain a great deal more than your father's conscience alone. I believe Mr. Josiah Prentice's actual murderer has lived free for 21 years, while an innocent man hanged in his place, and I believe your father, upon learning that the true circumstances of that old crime were finally about to come to light, chose flight and deception over the reckoning he had spent 2 decades avoiding. X. The missing money. There remained, Holmes noted, one further and rather practical matter to establish before the shape of the whole affair could be considered complete. Whether Sir Edmund Carrow had possessed, at the time of his disappearance, sufficient means to sustain a prolonged flight from justice, and whether any of that fortune had itself gone missing alongside its owner. Helena, consulted on this point, confirmed what Holmes had already begun to suspect. Her father's bank had reported, in the days following his disappearance, a substantial withdrawal made in cash some 4 days before Christmas Eve, a sum considerable enough to sustain a comfortable exile for a great many years, drawn out quietly and without explanation, and never subsequently accounted for by either the coroner's inquiry or the family solicitor, both of whom had assumed, reasonably enough at the time, that the money had simply been lost along with its owner beneath the ice. He planned this a considerable while in advance. Then, I observed, rather than fleeing in sudden panic upon learning that Vane, or whoever he truly is, had begun asking dangerous questions in the village. I believe the 2 discoveries arrived close enough together to be difficult to separate with certainty, Holmes said, but the withdrawal of funds 4 days before Christmas Eve, combined with the evident planning required to execute so careful a deception upon the ice, suggests a man who had already begun preparing his escape before Vane's presence in the village, forced his hand toward a rather more urgent timetable than he might otherwise have chosen. I suspect, Watson, that Sir Edmund had known for some months, or even years, that the truth of the Weathers case might one day surface, that some remnant of Michael Weathers's family might, in time, come looking for the justice the courts themselves had denied them, and had prepared, quietly and patiently, exactly the kind of escape a man in his position would require, waiting only for the moment his hand was finally forced to make use of it. Then Vane's arrival in the village was the spark, rather than the whole of the fire. Precisely so, Watson. A careful man does not build so elaborate an escape upon a single week's panic. He builds it across months or years of quiet, patient dread, and executes it, when the moment finally comes, with the same cold, calculating precision he brought to 20 years upon the bench. XB. The long grief I did not fully appreciate until Holmes had begun to piece together the wider shape of the Weathers family's history, quite how much quiet, patient suffering had accumulated across the 2 decades since that hasty and unjust trial, nor how directly that accumulated suffering had, in the end, driven the whole extraordinary sequence of events we now found ourselves investigating. Michael Weathers had been an orphan himself, raised by an aunt in modest circumstances, and had worked his way into Josiah Prentice's employ through nothing more remarkable than diligence and a good hand with figures. A young man, by every surviving account, of unremarkable but entirely decent character, engaged to be married that very spring to a local girl named Sarah, whom he had courted for the better part of 2 years with the patient devotion of a man who possessed little beyond his own good name and his own hard work to offer her. That engagement had proceeded against all expectation, even after his arrest. Sarah had visited him in prison throughout the whole of his brief incarceration, had married him, in fact, by special license, only 3 days before his execution, in a ceremony conducted within the prison chapel itself, that she might at least carry his name and whatever small dignity remained to him into whatever future awaited her as his widow. She had been, at the time of his death, already carrying a child who did not survive her own first terrible winter of grief. A double loss that Holmes's own inquiries confirmed had very nearly broken the young widow entirely, and from which, by her own later account to us, she had recovered only through the slow and patient labor of simply continuing to live, one difficult day at a time, for reasons she could not always clearly articulate even to herself. She had remarried, some years later, to a decent but unremarkable local farmer, and had raised, alongside her own subsequent children, the nephew who would eventually become known to the village of Thornfield as the mysterious Mr. Vane, a boy she had told, from his earliest years, the full and unflinching story of his uncle's unjust execution, not from any desire to burden him with a grief not properly his own, but because she believed, as she told Holmes during our second visit to her cottage, that a family's true history ought never be hidden from its own children, however painful that history proves to be, for a hidden grief has a way of growing considerably heavier than a grief openly carried and openly understood. Thomas had grown up, by this account, with his uncle's injustice as a kind of quiet, permanent fixture of his own understanding of the world. Not an obsession, precisely, for his grandmother insisted he had lived a perfectly ordinary and largely contented childhood in every other particular, but a steady, patient awareness that some debt remained unpaid, some wrong remained unrighted, and that he might, some day, if he applied himself with sufficient care and sufficient patience, be the one to finally right it. He told me, when he first proposed travelling to Hertfordshire to make his inquiries, that he did not expect to find anything at all. Sarah Weathers told us, during that same conversation. He said he simply could not continue living with the unanswered question hanging over his own conscience, whatever the eventual answer proved to be. I confess I feared for him a great deal, sending him off alone into a county full of strangers, chasing a truth that might, for all either of us knew, have simply been lost forever to the passage of 20 years. I am glad, now, that I did not forbid him the attempt, whatever anxious nights it has cost me since. 11. Mr. Vane reconsidered Holmes was determined, before proceeding further, to learn what he could of the mysterious Mr. Vane, and it was in pursuit of this inquiry that we made our way, the following morning, to the small cottage on the edge of the village where Michael Weathers's widow, a frail, white-haired woman named Sarah, now well past 70, had lived out the whole of the 21 years since her husband's execution. She received us with the particular wary courtesy of a woman who has learned, across a lifetime, to expect very little kindness from strangers arriving to ask about her husband's death, and it was some while before Holmes's evident sympathy and his careful avoidance of anything resembling accusation persuaded her to speak freely. "My grandson," she admitted at last, when Holmes inquired, as gently as I ever heard him inquire about anything, whether a young man matching Vane's description might be known to her. "Michael's boy, my daughter's son, for Michael and I were married but 8 months before they took him from me, and our own child did not live past her first winter, God rest her. But my daughter, Michael's sister, had a son of her own some years later, and I raised that boy on the story of his uncle, Mr. Holmes, because I could not bear to let the truth of what was done to this family simply be forgotten by everyone save myself. And this grandson has recently been to Thornfield, asking questions of the old case. He has spent the better part of a year, Mr. Holmes, working quietly through old records, old newspapers, anyone still living who might remember the particulars of the trial. He is a clever boy, cleverer than his circumstances ever gave him much opportunity to prove, and he told me, some months back, that he had found something in the old court papers that troubled him a very great deal, though he would not tell me precisely what, saying only that he wished to be certain of it before he raised my hopes for nothing. Do you know where he is now? The old woman's composure, so carefully maintained through the whole of our conversation, faltered at last. I do not, Mr. Holmes, and I confess it is the thing that frightens me most in this whole terrible business. He wrote to me faithfully every week, the whole time he was making his inquiries in your village. I have had no letter from him now in 3 weeks, since, I am given to understand, the very week that judge of yours vanished from his own lake. I saw Holmes's expression grow grave at this, and understood, watching him, that whatever theory he had begun to construct regarding Sir Edmund's careful, calculated flight, he had not yet fully accounted for what might have become of the young man who had, by every appearance, driven that flight into motion. I do not believe, Mrs. Weathers, that your grandson has come to any harm at Sir Edmund's own hand, Holmes said carefully. I believe, rather, that he may have played a rather more active role in the events of that Christmas Eve than the village's own theory of a foreign avenger currently allows for. But I cannot yet promise you the full truth of it, and I would not wish to offer you false comfort before I possess evidence sufficient to justify it. I promise you only that I will not rest until I understand precisely what has become of him, whatever that understanding proves to reveal. The false suspicion. It was on our journey back from Mrs. Weathers's cottage that Holmes first outlined, to my considerable surprise, the strategy he intended to pursue for the remainder of our investigation. I intend, Watson, to let the village continue believing precisely what it already believes. That young Vane, whatever his true name, murdered Sir Edmund Carrow upon that lake and fled the county to escape justice. I shall make no effort whatsoever to correct this impression, and I shall, if the opportunity presents itself, even encourage it a little further. You believe that unjust, surely, given what we have already learned of the true circumstances. I believe it temporarily necessary, Watson, and I do not undertake it lightly. Consider the position of a man who has staged his own disappearance, drawn a considerable fortune in secret, and is presently in hiding, waiting for the ideal moment to slip away to the continent and begin some new and comfortable life beyond the reach of English justice. Such a man watches the newspapers very closely indeed, Watson, and he watches, above all, for any sign that the official theory of his death has begun to unravel. If the county continues to believe him drowned, and continues to believe some vengeful stranger responsible for whatever violence they imagine occurred upon that ice, then Sir Edmund Carrow may grow complacent, may believe himself entirely safe, and may therefore make some move, some contact, some small carelessness that a man genuinely believing himself hunted would never risk. And Vane's own reputation, meanwhile, continues to suffer under a suspicion of murder he does not deserve, for which I am genuinely sorry, Watson, and which I intend to correct as swiftly and as thoroughly as circumstances permit, the very moment our investigation no longer requires the village's misapprehension to succeed. But I have found, across a great many cases, that the swiftest path to a wronged man's full vindication very often runs through a period of continued and uncomfortable suspicion, rather than around it, and I do not believe young Vane, whatever fear he must presently be enduring, wherever he has hidden himself, would thank us for exposing our own methods prematurely, and thereby losing our one genuine chance of bringing the true guilty party to a proper reckoning. I confess I found this reasoning rather harder to accept comfortably than most of Holmes's stratagems, precisely because it required the continued suffering of a young man already so grievously wronged by the very judge whose crimes we were attempting to expose. But I had learned, across many years beside him, that Holmes's patience in such matters was very rarely misplaced, however uncomfortable its immediate cost, and I resolved to trust him a while longer, whatever my own private misgivings. 12b. The groundskeeper's grievance. Before Holmes turned his full attention toward Mrs. Fell's discovery at the ice house, our investigation had passed through one further false trail, which I record here for the sake of a complete account, and because it illustrates, once again, the particular discipline Holmes brought to eliminating false possibilities before permitting himself to settle upon a true one. The Thornfield groundskeeper, a taciturn, weather-beaten man named Josiah Hobbs, had been dismissed from his position some 18 months before Sir Edmund's disappearance, following a dispute over wages that had, by the account of several villagers, left him nursing a considerable grievance against his former employer ever since. He had been heard, on more than one occasion at the local public house, muttering dark predictions about the old judge getting his due one of these days, and Constable Pike, the local officer first summoned to investigate the disappearance before Superintendent Hargreaves took a more direct interest in the matter, had considered him, for a brief period, the most promising suspect in what he still firmly believed to be a case of murder rather than mere misadventure. Holmes pursued this thread with the same careful thoroughness he had once applied to a similarly aggrieved workman in another case entirely, and arrived, within a single afternoon's inquiry, at a similarly definitive conclusion. Hobbs was in Bedfordshire on the night in question, Watson, attending his own daughter's wedding, a fact confirmed by no fewer than 30 witnesses, including the officiating vicar and a photograph taken at the wedding breakfast itself, which I have examined and found entirely genuine. Holmes set down the photograph he had borrowed from the delighted new bride, who had been rather more flattered than alarmed by a London detective's sudden interest in her own happy occasion. A man cannot simultaneously dance at his daughter's wedding in Bedfordshire and construct an elaborate deception upon a frozen lake in Hertfordshire, however deeply he may have wished the old judge ill in the abstract. Another wasted afternoon, then. Not wasted, Watson, merely instructive. A man who curses his enemy loudly and often, in the hearing of 30 witnesses at a public house, is very rarely the man executing a careful and silent deception in the dead of a winter's night. It is, I begin to suspect, something very near a universal principle of criminal psychology. The loud grievance and the quiet crime belong, almost without exception, to two entirely different species of man, and a detective does well to remember it before allowing local gossip to substitute for careful reasoning. I record this small diversion honestly, as I have always endeavoured to record the false starts alongside the eventual triumphs in these accounts, for Holmes himself insisted, across every case we shared together, that the public deserved an honest picture of a detective's method, one that included its patient eliminations quite as faithfully as its final, dramatic conclusions. 12c. Dr. Marsh's testimony. I have not yet mentioned, in the course of this account, our interview with the local physician, Dr. Marsh, who had been the first medical man summoned to Thornfield upon the discovery of Sir Edmund's abandoned trail, and whose original testimony had done a great deal, however unwittingly, to cement the county's comfortable belief in a simple drowning. Holmes called upon him not long after our first examination of the lake itself, and I confess the interview yielded rather less immediate drama than some of our other conversations in the course of this investigation, though it proved, in its own quieter way, quite as illuminating. I confess, I found the whole business troubling from the very first morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Marsh admitted, a stooped, gentle man of perhaps 60, who received us in a consulting room that smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco and old leather. A man does not simply vanish from solid ice without some trace remaining, and I said as much to the coroner at the time. But the coroner is a practical man, Mr. Holmes, and practical men prefer practical explanations, however imperfectly those explanations account for every particular fact. He pointed out, not unreasonably, that lakes have been known to conceal bodies for years at a time, carried by unseen currents into channels too deep or too obstructed for ordinary dragging to recover them, and I confess I had no better theory to offer against his in the moment, whatever my private unease. Did you examine the footprints yourself, with any care? I looked at them, certainly, though I am no expert in such matters, and I confess I noticed nothing beyond their plain and rather eerie termination. I am a physician, Mr. Holmes, trained to read the evidence of the human body rather than the evidence of snow and ice, and I fear I brought rather less useful expertise to that particular examination than the case genuinely deserved. You need not reproach yourself for it, Doctor. I have spent the better part of a lifetime training my own eye to notice precisely such details, and I would not expect a country physician, however conscientious, to possess the same specialized attention without cause to develop it. I wonder, however, whether you noticed anything at all unusual about Sir Edmund's general health or bearing in the weeks before his disappearance. Any sign of unusual anxiety, sleeplessness, or nervous strain that might, in hindsight, suggest a man labouring under some considerable private burden. Dr. Marsh considered this for a long moment. Now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes, I did attend him some 6 weeks before Christmas, for what he described as a troubling insomnia, and I recall being struck, at the time, by how uncharacteristically agitated he seemed throughout the whole consultation, a man ordinarily so composed, so entirely master of himself, fidgeting like a nervous schoolboy and asking me, of all things, whether a man's heart could genuinely fail from sustained worry alone, without any underlying physical cause. I prescribed him a mild sedative, and thought little more of it at the time, attributing his agitation to the ordinary anxieties of advancing age. I wonder now whether I ought to have looked rather more closely at what was truly troubling him. You could not have known, Doctor, what only his own conscience and a determined young stranger's careful research would eventually bring fully to light. I would not trouble yourself with retrospective guilt over a diagnosis no reasonable physician could have been expected to make. I found myself, hearing this small exchange, struck once again by a pattern I had first observed in the matter of the Baker Street lantern the previous winter, that a guilty man's private torment very often leaves some faint trace upon those around him, weeks or even months before his crime or his flight ever becomes generally known, and that only the particular patient attention of a detective like Holmes seems capable of gathering those scattered, half-noticed traces into a single coherent and damning pattern. Smoke above the ice-house. It was some 4 days later, days spent by Holmes in a great deal of quiet correspondence I was not always privy to, and by myself in the rather less glamorous work of keeping Helena Carrow's spirits from collapsing entirely under the weight of grief, suspicion, and the slow, grinding machinery of probate that continued regardless of the deeper mystery still unresolved beneath it, that the case took its next significant turn. It came, appropriately enough, from Mrs. Hudson's own counterpart at Thornfield, a sharp-eyed elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Fell, who had served the Carrow family for the better part of 30 years, and who mentioned to Helena, almost in passing over the household accounts, that she had twice now, on particularly cold nights, glimpsed a thin thread of smoke rising from the old ice-house at the far edge of the estate, a squat, half-buried stone structure, built generations before to store winter ice for the household's summer use, and long since fallen into disuse since the introduction of a proper icebox some years before. It has stood empty and unused these past 15 years, Mr. Holmes, Helena told us, when she relayed the housekeeper's account that same evening, her voice carrying a note of fresh alarm. There is no reason on earth anyone should have cause to light a fire there, and Mrs. Fell insists she is not mistaken, for she has lived on this estate long enough to know the shape of every building upon it by heart, even in the darkest hour of a winter's night. Holmes received this news with an intensity of interest that told me, more clearly than any words could have, precisely how significant he judged it to be. An old ice-house, Watson, standing empty, at the edge of an estate whose master vanished from the surface of a frozen lake some 3 weeks past, now showing signs of habitation on the very coldest nights, when no ordinary tramp or vagrant would willingly choose so exposed and miserable a shelter over the warmer comforts available in the village itself. He rose and crossed to the window, staring out into the dark toward the unseen lake beyond. I begin to suspect, Miss Carrow, that your father has not travelled nearly so far from Thornfield as either the county or his own careful planning intended. You believe he is hiding upon his own estate? I believe it entirely possible, and rather cleverer, in its own cold way, than fleeing immediately to some distant port where an alert constable might easily be watching for a man of his description. What safer place to wait out the first weeks of a manhunt, Watson, than the one place no one would ever think to search, the grounds of the very house he is believed to have died within sight of, hidden in a building the household itself has long since forgotten to think about at all. I asked, somewhat uneasily, whether he believed Helena's own safety might be at risk, sharing a house and grounds with a father whose true nature had proven so much darker than she had ever previously imagined. "I do not believe Sir Edmund means his own daughter any harm, Watson. Whatever else may be said of the man's crimes, nothing in the whole of our investigation suggests any coldness in his private affection for her, however coldly he has otherwise conducted his life. But I do believe it prudent that Miss Carrow say nothing whatsoever of Mrs. Fell's discovery to anyone beyond this room, and that we ourselves proceed with very great caution before revealing what we now suspect. A cornered man, even one who loves his own daughter, may prove considerably more dangerous than a man who still believes himself safely and comfortably hidden." The 14. The valet's absence. Holmes's next inquiry concerned a member of the household staff whose own conduct, once he began examining it carefully, proved rather more suspicious than anyone at Thornfield had previously troubled to notice. Sir Edmund's personal valet, a quiet, unassuming man named Cutler, who had served his master for some 11 years, and who had, by every account, been genuinely devoted to him. "Where was Cutler on the morning of Sir Edmund's disappearance?" Holmes asked Helena, over what had become our now customary evening consultation before the library fire. "He discovered my father's absence, Mr. Holmes, when he went to wake him at his usual hour, and found the bed unslept in. He raised the alarm himself, and has been, I think, quite as distraught as I have been through the whole of this dreadful business. More distraught in some ways, for he blames himself constantly for not somehow preventing whatever befell his master. And has his conduct, in the weeks since, struck you as in any way unusual?" Helena considered this with evident care. "He has taken to walking the grounds a great deal, Mr. Holmes, at odd hours. I had assumed it grief, or perhaps some private ritual of remembrance, for I know he was fond of my father in his own quiet way. He has also, now that you press me to think carefully upon it, been drawing rather more than his usual share of provisions from the kitchen stores. Bread, cold meat, a flask or two of brandy, which Mrs. Fell mentioned to me only last week as somewhat curious, though I confess I thought nothing of it at the time, assuming perhaps that grief had affected his appetite in some unusual direction, or that he shared his portion with some sweetheart in the village I knew nothing about. I believe, Miss Carrow," Holmes said slowly, "that Cutler's grief, however genuine his affection for his master, has taken a rather more practical form than mere private mourning. I believe he has known, from the very first morning, precisely where his master could be found, and has been quietly and loyally supplying him with provisions ever since, at considerable risk to his own position and liberty, out of 11 years' accumulated devotion to a man he still believes, whatever his private doubts, deserves that loyalty. I confess I found myself struck, hearing this, by the strange persistence of loyalty even toward men who have proven themselves genuinely unworthy of it, a persistence I had observed before in the case of the Baker Street lantern, in Mr. Whitfield's faithful keeping of a dead man's final wishes, and which I observed here again in a valet's quiet and dangerous devotion to a fugitive judge. It seemed to me, turning the thought over, one of the stranger and more enduring truths about the human heart, that loyalty, once given freely enough and long enough, does not always yield easily to the discovery that it was never entirely deserved. What do you intend to do, Holmes? I intend, Watson, to watch Cutler rather more closely than the household has troubled to watch him thus far, and I believe, if my reasoning holds true, that his own quiet loyalty will lead us directly to Sir Edmund Carrow considerably sooner than any amount of searching the wider county ever could. 15. A night's fruitless watch. We began our watch upon Cutler the following evening, and I will confess that our first night's vigil yielded nothing whatsoever beyond a great deal of cold and a considerable dent in my own patience, which had been rather better preserved during our earlier and equally fruitless nights outside number 14 in London the previous winter. Holmes had established our position in a dense thicket of holly some 50 yards from the servants' entrance, commanding a clear view of both the kitchen door and the path leading down toward the lake and the ice house beyond it. We settled in shortly after supper had been cleared, and remained through the whole of a bitter, moonless evening, watching the lit windows of the house grow dark one by one as the household retired, until only a single candle remained burning in what Helena had identified as Cutler's own small room above the stables. That candle burned steadily until nearly 1 in the morning, and then was extinguished, and Cutler did not stir from his quarters at all that night, so far as either of us could determine through hours of increasingly miserable observation. "He suspects he is watched," Holmes murmured, as we made our own way back to the inn in the small hours, our breath clouding thick in air gone bitterly cold. Or else he simply did not require provisioning his master on this particular night, having done so more recently than we know. Either explanation troubles me equally, Watson, for it suggests either that our own presence has already been noted by someone considerably more alert than the rest of this household, or that our timing has simply failed to align with whatever irregular schedule Cutler keeps for his nocturnal errands. I confess, I found the disappointment of that fruitless night weighing rather more heavily upon me than perhaps it ought to have, given how thoroughly Holmes had already demonstrated the soundness of his reasoning in every other particular of the case. But I had learned, across many winters beside him, that even the surest reasoning must sometimes wait upon opportunity, and that a detective's patience, however sorely tested, is very often rewarded only after it has first been thoroughly and uncomfortably exhausted. And if tomorrow yields nothing either, I believe I know a rather more direct method of drawing our quarry into the open, though I confess I would prefer to avoid it if patience alone can serve us just as well. To 16. Cutler, followed our second night's vigil, proved considerably more fruitful, though not without its own share of tension and near discovery. Cutler emerged from his quarters shortly after midnight, carrying a small covered basket and moving with the particular careful, deliberate quiet of a man who has performed the same furtive errand many times before and has grown skilled through long practice at avoiding detection. He kept to the shadow of the garden wall rather than the open path, circled wide around the boathouse rather than approaching it directly, and made his way at last, by a circuitous route that spoke eloquently of careful prior planning, toward the very stand of reeds and willows Holmes had identified as the point where Sir Edmund's backward walking trail had first left the ice. We followed at a careful distance, moving from shadow to shadow with as much stealth as 2 grown men in heavy winter coats could reasonably manage, across frozen and occasionally treacherous ground, and watched Cutler make his way at last to the squat stone bulk of the old ice house, glancing about himself once, briefly, before rapping upon its heavy wooden door in what was unmistakably some manner of prearranged signal. 3 short knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened from within, just wide enough to admit him, and closed again swiftly behind, and for a long moment Holmes and I remained crouched in our own concealment, watching the thin thread of lamplight that leaked, for just an instant, from around the door's edge before it swung shut once more. "We have found him, Watson," Holmes breathed, so quietly I felt rather than heard the words. "I do not believe we should confront him tonight, however. I should like to understand a good deal more about the conditions of his confinement, or, I should more accurately say, his hiding, before we move to end it." A cornered man, taken by surprise in the depth of a winter's night, with no warning and no time to compose himself, may say a great deal he would never otherwise reveal, and I do not wish to waste that single opportunity through impatience. We withdrew as quietly as we had come, and Holmes spent the whole of the following day in careful preparation, arranging through discreet correspondence with the local police superintendent, a cautious but capable man named Hargreaves, whom Holmes had taken pains to cultivate as an ally rather than a rival across the whole of our investigation, for a small and carefully briefed party to be ready, on a night of Holmes's choosing, to secure both the ice house and its occupant the moment the confrontation Holmes intended to force had run its necessary course. 16b. A conversation in the dark. I ought to record one further exchange from that second night's successful vigil, which occurred in the tense minutes between our first sighting of Cutler emerging from his quarters and our eventual decision to follow him toward the ice house, for it illustrates something of the particular strain such investigations placed upon even Holmes's own formidable composure. "You are certain we ought not simply confront him now, before he reaches whatever destination he intends?" I whispered, as we crouched together in the freezing shadow of the garden wall, watching Cutler's careful, deliberate progress across the moonlit snow. "I am certain of very little in this life, Watson, save that patience very rarely costs us more than impatience does, and very often costs us considerably less. Confront him now, and we learn only that Cutler is engaged in some manner of secret errand, which we already suspect. Follow him to his destination, and we learn where that destination lies, which is considerably more valuable information, and which we cannot afterwards simply invent through wishful confrontation. I confess, my feet have grown rather too cold for a great deal more patience tonight, Holmes. Your feet, Watson, have my genuine sympathy, and I promise you a very large fire and a very large brandy the moment we have concluded our business here. But I would remind you that Sir Edmund Carrow, wherever he presently sits, has endured very much colder nights than this one, for very much longer than the single evening you and I have now spent shivering behind this wall, and I find that thought alone sufficient to steady my own patience whenever it threatens to waver. I confess I found this particular comfort rather cold in its own right, though I could not fault the logic of it, and I settled back into my own miserable vigil with what fortitude I could muster, watching Cutler's careful shape recede into the moonlit distance, and trusting, as I had trusted Holmes through so many years and so many similarly uncomfortable nights before this one, that his patience would once again prove better founded than my own more immediate desire for warmth and resolution. It is a peculiar feature of detective work, I have come to believe across the whole of my long association with Sherlock Holmes, that its most decisive moments are very often preceded by long stretches of the most tedious and physically uncomfortable waiting imaginable, waiting that requires, of both detective and chronicler alike, a discipline the popular imagination rarely credits when it pictures the glamorous drama of a case's eventual and dramatic conclusion. I have shivered in more gardens, crouched behind more walls, and endured more freezing vigils in the course of chronicling Holmes's cases than any of my published accounts have ever fully conveyed. and I set down this particular small discomfort here only to remind you, my patient reader, that the satisfying conclusions I generally relate to you are built upon a foundation of very much less satisfying labor, most of which never makes its way into print at all. Vex vi. The confrontation prepared. I intend to go to him alone, Watson, or very nearly alone, Holmes told me, the evening before we finally moved to confront Sir Edmund Carrow in his frozen hiding place. I want you with me, certainly, for I value your steady hand and your steadier judgment a great deal more than I generally trouble to say aloud. But I do not want Hargreaves's men visible at the ice house itself until I have had the opportunity to speak with Sir Edmund directly, and to draw from him, if I am able, the fuller truth of the Weathers case before the mere fact of his arrest forecloses any further conversation. You believe he will speak freely, faced with capture. I believe, Watson, that a man who has spent 3 weeks hiding in a freezing icehouse, dependent upon a single loyal servant's nightly charity, sustained only by whatever comfort he can draw from the belief that his careful deception has succeeded, is a man whose nerve has very likely worn a good deal thinner than it was on the night he first conceived his plan. I believe, further, that such a man, confronted at last by the one detective in England capable of unraveling his scheme, may find in that confrontation a species of relief he has not permitted himself to feel in 3 long, cold, solitary weeks. The relief, Watson, of no longer needing to maintain, entirely alone and in perpetual fear of discovery, so vast and so exhausting a lie. I asked him, too, what had become of young Vane in all of this, whether Holmes believed the young man might himself be found somewhere near the icehouse, or whether some darker fate had befallen him after all. I have a theory regarding Mr. Vane, Watson, though I confess it remains unconfirmed until I have spoken with Sir Edmund directly. I do not believe, however, that we shall find him in any danger. I believe, rather, that we may find him considerably closer to the heart of tonight's confrontation than either the village or Mrs. Weathers herself currently suspects. He would say no more on the matter that evening, and I own that I passed a restless night in consequence, turning over in my own mind every possible shape the coming confrontation might take, and finding myself, by the time dawn finally broke, grey and bitter over the frozen countryside, no closer to guessing at the truth than I had been when Holmes first spoke his cryptic words. SVVB. Superintendent Hargreaves. I ought to say a word here about Superintendent Hargreaves himself, whose quiet and capable cooperation across the whole of our investigation had proven considerably more valuable than I have perhaps made clear in the account thus far, and whose own careful temperament stood in useful contrast to the more excitable theories the village at large had spent 3 weeks constructing. He was a broad, deliberate man of perhaps 50, with the particular unhurried manner of a career policeman who has learned, across many years, that most mysteries eventually yield to patience rather than drama, and he had received Holmes's involvement in the case with considerably more genuine welcome than Lestrade's characteristic gruffness had ever quite managed to convey in London. I'll not pretend I had any better theory than the drowning myself, Mr. Holmes, whatever private doubts I harboured, he admitted, during our final consultation before the icehouse confrontation. A judge does not simply vanish from his own back lawn without some manner of foul play or misadventure, and drowning seemed, on the evidence available at the time, the least troubling explanation available to a county eager to put the whole unpleasant business behind it. I confess I am rather more troubled now that you have laid the true shape of the matter before me by how comfortably we all allowed ourselves to accept so incomplete an explanation, simply because it required the least further inconvenience of us. You are hardly alone in that failing, Superintendent. I have observed, across a great many cases, that comfortable explanations very often triumph over accurate ones, not through any particular malice or incompetence, but through the ordinary human preference for a settled matter over an unsettled one. I do not fault you for it. I ask only that you now bring to the matter's proper resolution the same careful attention you might have brought earlier, had the true shape of things been clearer to you from the very first morning. Hargreaves had agreed, readily enough, to Holmes's careful plan for the confrontation itself, a plan that required, above all, his own men's discipline in remaining concealed and silent until the precise moment Holmes judged the confession sufficiently advanced to justify their intervention, a discipline Hargreaves himself undertook to enforce with the quiet, unshowy competence that had, I think, earned him Holmes's genuine respect across the whole of our brief but productive acquaintance. "I'll have my men in position by 9, Mr. Holmes, and not a sound out of them until you give the word, whatever hour that word finally comes. I've waited 3 weeks for a proper explanation of this business. I believe I can manage a few hours more of patience before I finally have it." XVIII, the Ice House. We went down to the Ice House on the 3rd night following, a night Holmes had chosen deliberately for its heavy, muffling snowfall, which would, he reasoned, both cover the sound of our approach and discourage any casual observation from the house above. Hargreaves and 2 constables waited, well concealed and under strict instruction, to remain hidden until summoned, at a discreet distance along the garden wall, while Holmes and I made our way alone through the thickening snow toward the squat stone building at the water's edge. Holmes knocked upon the heavy door himself, in the same pattern we had observed Cutler use 2 nights before. 3 short raps, a pause, then 2 more, and I heard, from within, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a long and telling silence. "You may open the door, Sir Edmund," Holmes called quietly, "or I may open it myself, for I assure you I am equal to the task regardless of your preference. I think you will find, either way, that the time for hiding has finally reached its natural conclusion." There was a further silence, longer this time, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn back, slow and reluctant, and the heavy door swung inward upon a scene I do not believe I shall ever entirely forget. The icehouse's interior, dim and lit only by a single guttering lamp, had been fitted out with the meagre comforts of a prolonged and increasingly desperate confinement. A narrow camp bed, a small stove whose thin pipe evidently vented, by some old and forgotten arrangement, through the structure's original ice chute, a scattering of provisions and empty bottles that spoke of weeks rather than days of occupancy. And there, seated upon the edge of that narrow bed, wrapped in blankets against a cold that no small stove could ever fully banish, sat a man I recognized, from the family portraits Helena had shown us, as Sir Edmund Carrow himself, though a considerably diminished version of the stern, imposing judge those portraits had preserved. His face had grown gaunt and grey with confinement and dread. His eyes, when they met Holmes's own, held an expression of exhausted, almost grateful resignation that told me, more clearly than any words, precisely how right Holmes's earlier reasoning about the relief of discovery had proven to be. "You have found me, then," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I confess I had begun to wonder, these past few days, whether I might simply be left to freeze quietly in this place, forgotten by the whole of the world, which would have spared us both this present unpleasantness. I do not believe you truly wished for that outcome, Sir Edmund. Whatever despair these past weeks have worn into you, Holmes said, stepping into the small, cold room with a gentleness that surprised me, given the gravity of the crimes we had come to confront him with. I believe, rather, that you have been waiting, whether you have fully admitted it to yourself or not, for precisely this moment, for someone to finally arrive who already knows the truth, and can therefore relieve you of the exhausting burden of continuing to construct it alone. 19. The reasoning laid bare. Sir Edmund said nothing for a long moment, staring into the small stove's dying fire with an expression I found, despite everything I now knew of his crimes, genuinely difficult to look upon without some measure of pity. "Tell me how you found me," he said at last. "I flatter myself the deception was rather cleverly constructed. I should like to know precisely where it failed." "It failed, Sir Edmund, in the very care with which you constructed it," Holmes said, and proceeded to lay out, with the same patient thoroughness he had shown at the Baker Street Lantern's final confrontation some months before, every thread of reasoning that had led us to this cold and narrow room, the subtle difference in heel depth between outward and backward walking footprints, the careful drift of that reverse trail toward a concealed stand of reeds rather than the boathouse from which the outward journey had begun, the second, smaller set of tracks awaiting him at that point of concealment, the substantial and unexplained withdrawal of funds 4 days before his disappearance, and, at the last, Cutler's own loyal and increasingly careless nocturnal errands, followed at last to their inevitable conclusion. Sir Edmund listened to the whole of this recitation with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his own long career listening to evidence marshalled against other men, and who recognizes, better than most, the precise moment at which a case has become unanswerable. "You built your career, I understand, upon the reasoning of others' guilt, Sir Edmund," Holmes said, once his own account had run its course. "I find there is a certain justice, however cold, in your own guilt being established through precisely the same patient assembly of small and individually unremarkable facts that you yourself, across 20 years upon the bench, so often dismissed as insufficient whenever it happened to favor a defendant's innocence rather than his conviction." "You refer to Weathers," Sir Edmund said quietly. It was not a question. "I refer to Michael Weathers, hanged 21 years ago for a murder I do not believe he committed, upon evidence I do not believe would satisfy any fair-minded jury properly instructed, following a trial whose swift and severe conclusion I believe you yourself deliberately engineered, in exchange for a sum of money paid to you by the true murderer of Josiah Prentice, a sum your own daughter has since found recorded in your own hand, in letters you were evidently either too careless or too arrogant to destroy across 20 years of otherwise careful concealment." XX. The confession. Sir Edmund's composure, already worn thin by weeks of cold and isolation, broke at last under the accumulated weight of this final, unanswerable accusation. "Prentice came to me himself," he said, his voice low and bitter, "some 3 weeks before that trial began. He had killed his own clerk over some dispute regarding stolen funds, a considerably more sordid affair than the newspapers of the day ever troubled to uncover, and he required, above all else, that suspicion fall swiftly and permanently upon someone else before his own irregular business dealings could be examined too closely by anyone with the wit to look for them. He offered me a sum of money, I will not pretend, even now, did not tempt me a very great deal. I had debts of my own at the time, Mr. Holmes. Debts I have spent the better part of 20 years since concealing from my own family and my own reputation alike, and Prentice's offer arrived at precisely the moment I most desperately required it, and you accepted it, knowing full well what it would cost an innocent young man. I told myself at the time that the evidence against Weathers was genuinely sufficient on its own merits, that Prentice's money merely rewarded a conclusion I would have reached regardless. I have told myself that particular lie for 21 years, Mr. Holmes, and I confess I very nearly believed it myself, for the greater part of that time. He pressed one trembling hand against his eyes. It was only when young Vane, for that is not his true name, though I shall not trouble you with the correction, since I believe you have already guessed it, began asking his careful questions in the village, some months past, that I was finally forced to confront how thoroughly I had deceived myself. He came to me directly, in fact, some 2 months before Christmas Eve. He had found, through his own patient research, sufficient evidence to reopen the case entirely, and he offered me, in what I can only describe as an act of considerably more mercy than I deserved, the opportunity to confess voluntarily, to clear his uncle's name through my own admission, before he was forced to pursue the matter through more public and more damaging channels. And you refused him. I refused him, and worse, Mr. Holmes. I threatened him, in a manner I am not proud to recall, with the full weight of whatever legal and social power a retired judge might still bring to bear against so young and so friendless an accuser. I believed, in my arrogance, that I could simply frighten him into silence, exactly as I had frightened away every other threat to my reputation across 2 comfortable decades. He did not frighten easily. He told me, quite calmly, that he intended to bring his evidence before the proper authorities, regardless of my threats, and that he would give me exactly 1 month to reconsider my refusal before he did so. XX-B. The weight of small comforts. I ought to record one further detail of that ice-house confrontation before proceeding to the fuller mechanics of the case's resolution, for it struck me, even in the midst of so grave a scene, as one of the more genuinely human moments I have witnessed across my whole career chronicling Holmes's investigations. Sir Edmund, still wrapped in his blankets against the bitter cold of his makeshift prison, asked Holmes, in a voice that had grown suddenly and unexpectedly hesitant, whether his daughter had suffered a great deal in the weeks since his disappearance. "She has suffered, Sir Edmund, though I believe you already knew she would, when you first conceived this plan," Holmes said, his tone carrying neither cruelty nor false comfort, but simply the plain honesty I had come to recognize as his most consistent mercy toward those he confronted. "She has suffered the ordinary grief of believing her father drowned, and she has suffered, more recently and more sharply, the rather different grief of discovering what manner of man that father actually proved to be. I will not pretend to you that either grief has been light for her to carry." Sir Edmund closed his eyes briefly, and I saw something pass across his gaunt face that looked, in that dim lamplight, very much like genuine physical pain rather than merely emotional distress. I told myself, Mr. Holmes, in the comfortable early days of planning this whole scheme, that a daughter's grief for a father believed drowned would prove gentler, in the end, than a daughter's shame at a father exposed as corrupt. I see now how thoroughly I miscalculated that particular arithmetic, for I have given her both griefs in sequence rather than sparing her either one, and I do not know that there exists any apology adequate to that particular failure of foresight. I do not believe adequate apology is generally available to any of us, Sir Edmund, for our most serious failures. I believe only that honest acknowledgement of a failure, however inadequate as true remedy, remains considerably better than the comfortable silence you have practiced for 20 years regarding the far graver failure that began this whole unfortunate chain of consequence. I would encourage you, when the formal proceedings against you finally conclude, to write to your daughter directly, and to offer her that same honest acknowledgement, rather than whatever further comfortable justification your own considerable intelligence might otherwise tempt you to construct in its place. I do not know, in the end, precisely what correspondence passed between Sir Edmund and his daughter during the months of his subsequent trial and imprisonment, for Helena never discussed the matter with either Holmes or myself in any great detail, and I judged it improper to press her upon so evidently private a subject. I know only that she visited him once, some months into his imprisonment, and that she returned from that single visit with an expression Holmes described to me afterward as the particular exhausted peace of a woman who has finally said everything she needed to say, and heard, in return, rather more honest acknowledgement than she had perhaps expected to receive. 21. The plan conceived, and so you began to plan your escape, Holmes said quietly. I began to plan my escape, Mr. Holmes, because I could not face what a full public reckoning would mean, not merely for myself, but for Helena, who has never done anything in her whole life to deserve the disgrace of a father exposed as a corrupt judge who sent an innocent man to the gallows for money. I told myself, in my own particular species of self-deception, that disappearing entirely, allowing the world to believe me drowned rather than exposed, would spare her the worst of that disgrace. She would grieve a father lost to tragic accident, rather than despise a father exposed as a criminal. I see now, of course, how thoroughly I deceived myself yet again, for I understand from your own account that she has already found the letters, and grieves, if anything, a rather more complicated grief than the simple accident I had hoped to spare her. You planned the footprints yourself. I have walked that lake every winter morning for 3 years, Mr. Holmes. I know its ice, its currents, its every particular, rather better than I know most things in this world. The idea of walking backward in my own tracks came to me one sleepless night some weeks before Christmas, and I confess I found a certain grim satisfaction in perfecting it, practicing, alone upon the ice at dawn before the household woke, until I could walk in reverse, nearly as naturally as forward. I chose Christmas Eve deliberately, for I knew the household would be occupied with its own preparations and less likely to notice my early absence, and I arranged, through Cutler's loyal assistance, for a change of clothes and provisions to be waiting for me at the reed bank, and for him to continue supplying me in this ice house until I judged it safe to make my way, by night and by careful stages, to a port from which I might finally take ship for the continent. And young Vane, what became of him that his own grandmother has had no word from him in 3 weeks? Sir Edmund was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. He came to me again, Mr. Holmes, on the very night of my disappearance, waiting for me, exactly as I had waited for him at the reed bank, though I confess it was by his own design rather than mine. He had grown suspicious, in the final days before Christmas, that I intended some manner of flight rather than confession, and he had kept his own careful watch upon me, closer than I ever suspected. He confronted me at the reed bank itself, just as I completed my careful reversal of those tracks, and told me he had followed me from a distance and understood precisely what I intended. 21b. A judge's own reckoning. I ought to record here, before proceeding further with the narrower question of Thomas Weathers's whereabouts, a longer passage of Sir Edmund's own confession that Holmes drew from him that night, for I believe it illuminates, rather more fully than the bare mechanics of his crime and his flight, precisely how a man of such evident intelligence and such long professional discipline could have arrived at so catastrophic a moral failure, and remained there, unrepentant in any active sense, for 21 years. "You wish to understand how I lived with it, Mr. Holmes," Sir Edmund said, when Holmes pressed him gently on this very point. "I have asked myself the same question 1,000 times across 20 years, and I confess I have never found an answer that satisfies me, though I have constructed a great many that satisfied me well enough to continue sleeping at night, for a time at least. I told myself, in those early years, that Weathers's flight from the scene proved his guilt regardless of Prentice's money, a comfortable enough fiction, for a young man's panic in the face of a murder charge he could not disprove looks, to an uncharitable eye, very much like the flight of the genuinely guilty. I told myself, later, that the money changed nothing material in the verdict, since I would have convicted him in any case, though I confess, Mr. Holmes, I have never been entirely certain that particular comfort was true, and I have spent 20 years deliberately avoiding too close an examination of my own certainty on the matter, precisely because I feared what a truly honest examination might reveal. And in more recent years? In more recent years, Mr. Holmes, I told myself simply that too much time had passed for the truth to matter any longer, that Weathers was long dead, his widow presumably remarried or herself deceased, and that no earthly good could come from disturbing a grief 2 decades settled, merely to satisfy my own belated conscience, at the cost of my daughter's inheritance, and my own remaining years of comfortable retirement. It was, I see now, the most comfortable and the most cowardly of all my fictions, for it dressed my own continued self-interest in the borrowed clothes of consideration for others. Holmes listened to this recitation with a gravity I had come to expect of him in moments of genuine moral weight, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the satisfaction a lesser detective might have permitted himself at having so thoroughly unmasked a guilty man's self-deception. "I have observed, Sir Edmund, across a great many cases involving crimes of this particular character, that the comfortable fictions a guilty man constructs to continue living with himself are very rarely stupid fictions. They are, almost without exception, cleverly enough reasoned to withstand a great deal of casual self-examination, precisely because the men who construct them are very often intelligent men, skilled in exactly the kind of reasoning your own profession once demanded of you daily. It is, I think, one of the more troubling truths my own career has taught me, that intelligence offers no particular protection against moral cowardice, and may, in fact, provide a man considerably more sophisticated tools with which to disguise that cowardice from himself, long after a less clever man might have been forced by simple honesty to confront it. I saw Sir Edmund receive this observation with something that looked, in the dim lamplight of that cold stone room, very nearly like relief. The relief, perhaps, of a man who has finally heard his own particular failure named plainly and accurately, after 20 years of constructing ever more elaborate justifications to avoid naming it himself. "Sound lie, where vain waited. You did not harm him," Holmes said. It was not entirely a question, though I heard in it a genuine and pressing concern. "I did not harm him, Mr. Holmes. Whatever else you may believe me capable of, I had spent 20 years sending other men to punishment I was never willing to face myself. I found I could not, in the end, add violence against an innocent young man to the whole catalogue of my sins, however desperately his continued freedom threatened my own careful plan of escape. Sir Edmund's voice carried, for the first time in our whole conversation, something that might genuinely have been called shame rather than mere calculation. I told him the truth instead, Mr. Holmes, the whole truth, exactly as I have told it to you tonight, standing there upon the frozen bank in the last hour before dawn. I confessed to him what I had never confessed to another living soul, and I asked him, having confessed it, what he intended to do with a truth he could not yet prove without my own voluntary corroboration. And what did he say? He wept, Mr. Holmes. 20 years of grief and injustice, finally given voice by the very man responsible for it, and he simply wept, there in the cold and the dark, in a manner I do not believe I shall ever forget for whatever remains of my own life. And then he told me that he did not want my death, nor even, strictly speaking, my punishment. He wanted only his uncle's name cleared, and some public acknowledgement, however belated, that Michael Weathers had been innocent of the crime that took his life. He offered me a choice that night, Mr. Holmes, considerably more merciful than any choice I had ever offered a defendant across 20 years upon my own bench, that I might disappear as I had planned, and live out whatever years remained to me in whatever quiet exile I could arrange, provided I first wrote out, in my own hand, a full confession to the Weathers case, to be delivered to the proper authorities only after sufficient time had passed for my own escape to be safely accomplished. And you agreed. I agreed, Mr. Holmes, and I have spent every day since, in this cold and solitary confinement, drafting and redrafting that confession, unable to find within myself either the courage to send it before my own escape was fully secured, nor the will to abandon the escape and simply surrender myself honestly, as any genuinely repentant man surely would have done from the very first night. He gestured with a trembling hand toward a small writing desk in the corner of the ice house, upon which lay a considerable sheaf of paper, covered in a cramped and evidently much revised hand. There is my confession, Mr. Holmes, such as it is, unfinished, imperfect, and, I confess, rather more concerned with my own justification than young Vane's uncle rightly deserves. I do not know that I would ever have found the courage to complete it and send it, left entirely to my own devices. I believe, in truth, some part of me has been waiting these 3 weeks for precisely this, for someone to arrive who would finally take the choice out of my own unreliable hands. X-I-I-E-ing, where Vane is now? Where is he now, Sir Edmund? Where is young Vane? I do not know precisely, Mr. Holmes, though I believe I can guess. He told me, on that last night, that he intended to return to London, to consult a solicitor of his own regarding how best to proceed once my confession finally arrived, and to say nothing to his grandmother of our encounter until the whole matter had been properly and legally resolved, that he might spare her the anguish of hope raised, and then, perhaps, disappointed. I have had no word from him since, though I confess I have wondered, more than once in these long, cold nights, whether he lost his nerve entirely, or met with some misfortune of his own upon the road, or simply decided, in the end, that a confession from a coward too frightened to deliver it himself was not worth waiting for. Holmes's expression, hearing this, grew thoughtful in a manner I had come to recognize as the particular stillness of a man rapidly assembling a final piece of reasoning. "I believe, Sir Edmund, that your Mr. Vane has done precisely as he told you he would, and has simply exercised rather more patience and rather more caution than your own guilty conscience has permitted you to credit him with. A young man who has waited 20 years for justice, and who has finally been offered a path toward it, however imperfect, does not abandon that path lightly after coming so close to its fulfillment. I believe we shall find him in London, exactly where he said he would be, and I believe, moreover, that his grandmother's fear these past 3 weeks has caused him rather more genuine distress than his own continued silence has caused anyone else in this whole sorry affair." He turned then to me, and I saw in his face the particular settling calm that meant a case had, in every essential particular, reached its conclusion. "I believe, Watson, that we have heard everything Sir Edmund has to tell us, and I believe the time has come to summon Hargreaves and his men, and to see this whole matter carried, at long last, into the proper light of day. XXIV." The arrest Hargreaves and his constables entered the ice-house within minutes of Holmes's summons, and Sir Edmund Carrow submitted to arrest with a resignation so complete it seemed, to my own eye, very nearly a relief to him, the particular relief of a man who has finally set down a burden he lacked the courage to set down himself. "I do not ask for mercy, Mr. Holmes," he said, as the constables settled a blanket about his shoulders against the bitter cold of the walk back to the house. "I ask only that you see my confession properly delivered, and that whatever remains of my reputation be spent, if it must be spent at all, in securing a full and public pardon for Michael Weathers, however posthumous and however inadequate such a pardon must necessarily be at this late hour." "I will see to it personally, Sir Edmund," Holmes said, "though I confess I take considerably more satisfaction in the promise, for the sake of Michael Weathers's memory and his widow's long-suffering patience, than for any comfort it may bring to you." We walked back to the house together through snow that had, by then, begun to fall in earnest, heavy and silent, softening every hard edge of that terrible night into something almost gentle, and I found myself thinking, as we climbed the long dark lawn toward Thornfield's lit windows, of Sir Edmund's own words about the lake keeping its own ledger, and settling its accounts in its own good time, a superstition certainly, and one Holmes had dismissed with characteristic dryness upon our very first evening in the village, and yet one that seemed, in that quiet, snow-muffled hour, to have proven itself rather more prophetic than either of us had been willing to credit at the time. XCVB. Cutler's Confession. I ought to record, before proceeding to Helena's own reckoning with the truth of her father's crimes, the fate of the loyal valet Cutler, whose quiet devotion had sustained Sir Edmund through the whole of his 3 weeks' confinement, and who had, by any strict reading of the law, made himself an accessory to that confinement's underlying deception. He was found, upon our return to the house, waiting anxiously in the servants' hall, having evidently guessed, from the unusual comings and goings of that snowy night, that his careful secret had finally come to light. He made no attempt whatsoever to deny his role once confronted, and indeed seemed, by Holmes's own private observation to me afterward, almost relieved to finally set down the burden of a deception he had carried alone for 3 exhausting weeks. "I do not ask you to excuse it, sir," he told Hargreaves, with a dignity that impressed me a great deal, given the circumstances. I knew what I was doing when I first carried provisions down to that ice house, and I knew, better than most, precisely what manner of man I was protecting by doing it. I did it because Sir Edmund took me into his service 11 years ago, when I had nowhere else to turn and precious few honest prospects before me, and because a man does not simply abandon 11 years of loyalty the moment that loyalty becomes inconvenient or even dangerous to maintain. I do not know that I would make the same choice again, knowing now the full truth of what he did to young Weathers. But I made it then, in genuine ignorance of that truth, believing only that my master had fallen into some manner of difficulty and required my help to weather it, and I do not believe I can honestly regret the loyalty itself, whatever regret I now feel for the particular object of it. Hargreaves, to his credit, showed considerably more leniency toward Cutler than the strict letter of the law might have demanded, recognizing, I think, the genuine difference between a man who conceals a crime he fully understands and a man who extends loyal service in good faith, only to discover too late the true nature of what that service ultimately protected. Cutler was permitted, in the end, to give his testimony as a witness rather than face prosecution himself as an accessory, and Helena, for her own part, retained him in her household service throughout the whole of the difficult months that followed, judging, as she told us herself, that a man's 11 years of honest devotion ought to count for something, even when that devotion was finally, if unknowingly, spent in service of a lie. XXIV-C, Cutler's Own History. I found myself, in the weeks following his testimony, genuinely curious about the particular circumstances that had bound so loyal and evidently decent a man so closely to a master whose true character had proven, in the end, so thoroughly unworthy of that loyalty, and I put the question to Cutler himself, as gently as I could manage, during one of my own subsequent visits to Thornfield. He had come to Sir Edmund's service, I learned, at a considerably lower point in his own life than his subsequently steady 11 years might have suggested, dismissed from a previous position under a cloud of suspicion he had never fully managed to clear, accused, unjustly as it later transpired, of a theft actually committed by a fellow servant who had since confessed the crime on his own deathbed, though far too late to restore Cutler's reputation at the time it had mattered most. Sir Edmund took me on when no other household in the county would so much as consider my application, Doctor, Cutler told me. He told me himself, quite plainly, that he did not much care what the county believed of my character, only what he could determine of it through his own direct observation, and that a man ought to be judged by his actual conduct rather than by whatever gossip happened to attach itself to his name. I confess that particular kindness, extended to me at the very lowest point of my own life, bound me to him a great deal more thoroughly than 11 years of ordinary wages ever could have managed alone. I found this account, once I had absorbed its full implication, to sit rather uneasily alongside everything else I had since learned of Sir Edmund's character. For here was a man capable of the most calculating cruelty toward Michael Weathers, sacrificing an innocent life for the sake of his own comfortable finances, and yet also capable, it seemed, of a genuine and practical kindness toward a servant the rest of the county had too readily condemned on the strength of mere rumour. I mentioned this apparent contradiction to Holmes, who considered it with his usual careful attention, before offering an observation that has stayed with me ever since. I do not believe it so very great a contradiction as it first appears, Watson. A man's capacity for genuine kindness in one direction does not necessarily constrain his capacity for genuine cruelty in another, particularly when that cruelty serves his own more pressing self-interest. Sir Edmund's kindness toward Cutler cost him nothing of any real consequence. A servant's wages, a household position, the ordinary decency any reasonable employer might extend without particular strain. His cruelty toward Weathers, by contrast, protected a fortune and a reputation he valued a great deal more highly than he ever valued the life of a young clerk he had never personally met before the trial itself. I have found, across a great many cases, that human character very rarely divides itself so neatly into simple good and simple evil as the storybooks would have us believe. Most men, Watson, are capable of both kindness and cruelty, in roughly equal measure, and the true measure of a man's character lies not in which capacity he happens to possess, for nearly everyone possesses both, but in which capacity he chooses to indulge when the two come into direct and costly conflict with one another. Tex ex vive. Helena's reckoning. Helena Carrow received the news of her father's discovery and his confession with a composure that surprised even Holmes, who had, I think, privately braced himself for a considerably more violent reaction. "I had already begun to grieve the father I believed I had, Mr. Holmes," she told us, some days later, once the first flurry of official proceedings had settled into their proper legal channels. "I find I have very little grief left over for the father revealed by his own confession. I am glad, at least, that he has finally told the truth, however belatedly, and I am glad that some measure of justice, however imperfect, may yet be done for Mr. Weathers and his family. I do not know that I can forgive my father for what he has done. I am not entirely certain forgiveness is mine to offer. In any case, when the greater debt is owed to a family, my father's own crime very nearly destroyed. You need not forgive him, Miss Carrow, in order to move forward with your own life," Holmes said gently. "Grief and judgment are not obligated to arrive at the same conclusion, whatever the storybooks may wish us to believe. I think you have shown, across this whole difficult month, considerably more moral clarity than your father managed across the whole of his own long career, and I believe that clarity will serve you a great deal better in the years ahead than any forced or premature forgiveness ever could." It was some weeks later, once the spring thaw had finally begun to soften the last of the winter's ice, that Helena arranged, at her own initiative, and very much against her solicitor's cautious advice, to meet with young Vane, whose true name, I should note here, proved to be Thomas Weathers, named for the very uncle whose wrongful execution had shaped the whole of his young life, and with his grandmother, Sarah, the widow who had waited 21 years for precisely the vindication Sir Edmund's confession had finally, however belatedly, provided. I was present, at Holmes's own quiet insistence, for that first meeting, held in the same modest cottage where we had first learned of Thomas's existence, and I do not believe I have ever witnessed a more delicate or more genuinely moving exchange between two families joined, however unwillingly, by a single terrible crime committed 21 years before either of the two young people involved had been old enough to understand its weight. "I do not know what I can possibly say to you," Helena told Thomas, her composure, so carefully maintained through weeks of scandal and legal proceeding, finally beginning to crack. "My father took your uncle's life and your family's peace. For money, he did not even need desperately enough to justify the crime. I cannot offer you restitution for 21 years of grief. I do not know that any restitution exists that could possibly be adequate to it." "You do not owe me restitution, Miss Carrow," Thomas said quietly. "You did not commit your father's crime, any more than I committed whatever crime my own uncle was falsely convicted of. I came to Thornfield seeking only the truth, and I have found it, at considerable cost to us both. I do not believe either of us is well served by adding guilt we did not personally earn to grief we did not personally choose. I have thought often, in the years since, of that quiet exchange between two young people whose lives had been shaped so profoundly by a single act of cowardice and greed committed decades before either of them was born, and I have come to believe it represents, in its own modest way, one of the truest and most hopeful resolutions I have ever witnessed in the whole of my long association with Sherlock Holmes. 25b. A doctor's small comfort. I found myself, in the weeks following Sir Edmund's arrest, spending rather more time in Helena Carrow's company than my strict professional obligations to Holmes's investigation any longer required, for I had grown, across the whole difficult month of our acquaintance, genuinely fond of her steady courage in the face of a grief no young woman ought reasonably to have been asked to bear alone. I called upon her one particularly bleak February afternoon, ostensibly to inquire after her health, which had suffered somewhat under the accumulated strain of the preceding weeks, and found her seated in her father's old study, surrounded by the very ledgers and papers that had first revealed his corruption to her, sorting through them with a methodical determination that struck me as both admirable and, I confess, a little troubling in its evident exhaustion. "You need not do this alone, Miss Carrow," I told her, settling into the chair opposite with the particular gentle authority I had learned, across many years of medical practice, to bring to patients labouring under grief they had not yet permitted themselves to properly feel. A solicitor could manage the greater part of this tedious sorting, and spare you the daily reminder of exactly what you are sorting through. I know it, Doctor, and I thank you for the concern, but I find I need to understand the full extent of what my father did, in his own hand, rather than receiving it second-hand through some solicitor's careful summary. I do not know that I can properly begin rebuilding whatever remains of my own life here until I have first fully faced the whole of what I am rebuilding it upon. I recognized, in her words, something of the same instinct that had driven Holmes himself across every case I had witnessed him undertake, the conviction that comfortable ignorance, however tempting in the short term, very rarely serves anyone half so well as difficult, fully examined truth, and I told her so, as gently as I could manage. "Mr. Holmes would tell you, I think, that you have inherited rather more of his own particular temperament than you perhaps realize. Miss Carrow, however different the circumstances that have called it forth in you, she managed, at this, the first genuine smile I had seen from her in the whole of our difficult acquaintance. I shall take that as a very great compliment, Doctor, whatever complicated company it places me in. I find I would rather resemble Mr. Holmes's patient honesty than my own father's comfortable evasions, whatever the cost of that resemblance proves to be. I have thought often, in the years since, of that small exchange, and of the particular, quiet courage it takes for a young woman to choose difficult truth over comfortable evasion, especially when that truth concerns the very foundation of everything she had previously believed about her own family and her own history. I do not believe Helena Carrow ever fully recovered from the particular grief her father's crimes inflicted upon her, but I believe, watching her build a genuinely hopeful new life in the years that followed, that she recovered rather more completely than most people could reasonably have expected, precisely because she refused, from the very first difficult week, to build that recovery upon any foundation less solid than the whole and complete truth. XV. The trial. Sir Edmund Carrow's trial, when it came the following summer, drew rather more national attention than the modest county proceedings against Cornelius Ashworth had drawn some seasons before. For there is a particular fascination the public reserves for a judge exposed as a criminal, a fascination equal parts outrage and, I think, a certain grim satisfaction at watching the machinery of justice turn at last upon one of its own most severe former operators. He did not contest the charges regarding the Weathers case, his own written confession, completed, at last, and properly delivered before his arrest, exactly as he had promised Thomas Weathers it would be, providing evidence so thorough and so damning that no defense could plausibly have been mounted against it in any case. The considerably more complicated legal question of what precise charges could be brought against a judge for a crime committed and concealed for over 2 decades occupied the courts for some while, and I will not trouble you with the finer points of law that Holmes himself found, by his own admission, rather less interesting than the human drama that had produced them. It is sufficient to record that Sir Edmund was convicted, in the end, of accepting a bribe to pervert the course of justice, and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that would, given his age and evidently failing health, very likely see him spend whatever years remained to him entirely within its walls. The considerably more significant proceeding, so far as Holmes himself was concerned, was the posthumous review of Michael Weathers's original conviction, a review that concluded, some months after Sir Edmund's own trial, with a full and formal pardon, granted 21 years too late to do the man himself any earthly good, but delivered with a public acknowledgment of the miscarriage of justice that meant, at least, that his name might finally be cleared in the eyes of a county that had once been so swift to condemn him. Sarah Weathers attended the final proceeding herself, frail but resolute, and I am told, for Holmes and I had by then returned to London and our own more ordinary affairs, that she wept openly upon hearing the pardon read aloud, not from any renewed grief, but from the particular relief of a woman who has finally, after 21 years, been permitted to grieve her husband as an innocent man rather than continuing to carry, alongside her sorrow, the additional and unjust burden of a county's quiet, unspoken suspicion. XVB. The newspapers take notice. I ought to record something of the considerable public interest the trial excited, for I believe it illustrates a curious feature of English justice that Holmes himself remarked upon more than once during those months, namely, that the public appetite for a fallen judge's disgrace very often exceeds, by a considerable margin, its appetite for the quieter and more genuinely important matter of a wrongly executed man's belated vindication. The London papers covered Sir Edmund's own trial with a thoroughness bordering on relish, dispatching correspondence to the county courthouse each day of the proceedings, and filling column after column with speculation regarding the judge's motives, his private character, and the various rumours, some accurate, a great many entirely invented, that had begun circulating regarding the details of his 3 weeks' concealment in the old ice-house. Holmes found this coverage, on the whole, rather distasteful, though he acknowledged its usefulness in one particular respect. The very sensationalism I generally find so wearisome in the popular press, Watson, has at least ensured that Michael Weathers's name will not be quietly forgotten a second time, as it so nearly was after his original execution. A story vivid enough to sell newspapers is, I find, also vivid enough to lodge itself in the public memory rather more permanently than a quiet correction buried in some legal journal's back pages ever could. I take what benefit I can from an instrument I do not otherwise much admire. I noted, too, that several of the more thoughtful newspapers took the occasion to publish longer reflections upon the broader question of judicial corruption and the particular vulnerability of capital cases to exactly the kind of miscarriage that had claimed Michael Weathers's life. Pieces that Holmes read with rather more genuine interest than the sensational daily coverage, and which he clipped and kept, I noticed, in a growing file he maintained on questions of legal reform, a subject he pursued with a quiet persistence throughout the whole of his later career that the popular image of him as a purely private detective, uninterested in broader questions of justice, has never fully credited him for. A single case, however thoroughly solved, corrects only a single injustice, Watson, he told me, some while after the trial's conclusion. I confess, I have grown increasingly interested, as my own career has progressed, in whatever small influence I might exert toward correcting the systems that allow such injustices to occur in the first place, rather than contenting myself merely with unraveling them, one at a time after the fact. It is slower and considerably less satisfying work than the puzzle-solving you generally chronicle in these accounts of yours, Watson, and I do not know that I shall ever see it bear fruit substantial enough to satisfy me fully. But I find I cannot, in good conscience, simply return every wrongly convicted man's name to its proper innocence without at least attempting to understand, and perhaps in some small way address, whatever systemic failure permitted the wrong conviction in the first place. What the village learned, I ought to record, finally, something of how the village itself received the truth once it emerged, for I believe the transformation of local opinion illustrates rather neatly the same pattern Holmes had observed regarding comfortable stories and accurate ones, now working itself out in reverse. Beckett himself, when I called at the Carrow Arms some months after the trial's conclusion, greeted me with rather more sheepish good humour than his earlier confident pronouncements about the lake's supernatural ledger might have led me to expect. "I'll not pretend I wasn't wrong about the whole business, Doctor, and a good deal more wrong than I generally care to admit to a paying customer," he said, drawing my pint with the same practiced relish he had once reserved for his ghost stories, now redirected toward an equally enthusiastic retelling of Holmes's actual solution. Though I'll say this in my own defense, a backward-walking judge hiding in his own ice-house makes for a stranger tale than any ghost story I've told in 30 years behind this bar, and I don't mind saying I've told it rather more often since than I ever told the old governess's legend, for all that this one has the advantage of being entirely true. I found this transformation, repeated in one form or another, across a great many conversations with the village's various inhabitants that year, rather heartening in its own modest way. Not because the truth had proven any less strange or unsettling than the ghost story it replaced, but because it had proven, in the end, considerably more useful. The old legend of the drowned governess had offered the village only a vague and unproductive dread, a story that explained nothing and prevented nothing, content merely to darken the lake's reputation across successive generations without ever illuminating anything true about the world. Holmes's actual solution, by contrast, had exposed a genuine corruption, cleared an innocent man's name, and reunited two families who might otherwise have continued, indefinitely, to nurse their separate and unexamined grievances against a past neither of them properly understood. "I have found, across a great many cases, Watson," Holmes remarked to me when I described Beckett's transformed attitude some while later, "that a frightened community very often prefers its comfortable ghost story precisely because that story asks nothing further of anyone. A ghost, once accepted, requires no further investigation, no uncomfortable reckoning with buried facts, no difficult conversation with a neighbor whose own conduct might bear closer examination than anyone has troubled to give it. The truth, by contrast, is very often considerably more demanding of its discoverers, requiring not merely acceptance, but action, a pardon secured, a reputation cleared, a family reunited, a corrupt man finally held to account for sins 2 decades buried. I do not begrudge Beckett and his fellow villagers their old ghost story, Watson, for it cost them nothing beyond a pleasant shiver on a winter's evening. But I confess I take rather more satisfaction in having replaced it, however temporarily, with a truth that has actually accomplished something of genuine and lasting value. XXV. What the case left behind? I asked Holmes, some evenings after our return to Baker Street, whether he counted the matter of the frozen lake among his more satisfying successes, much as I had once asked him the same question regarding the Baker Street lantern. He considered the question with his usual care, settling deeper into his chair before our own familiar fire, the London fog pressing soft against our own familiar windows. It is, I think, among the more elegant puzzles I have encountered in some years, Watson, purely as a matter of mechanics. The backward walking trick was cleverly enough conceived that I confess it very nearly deceived even my own careful eye on that first afternoon at the lake. But I find, reflecting upon it now, that the mechanics interest me rather less than the moral shape of the whole affair. Here was a man who spent 20 years building a reputation for severity and justice, while concealing, beneath that reputation, a single act of corruption so grave it cost an innocent man his life, and who was undone, in the end, not by some clever adversary determined upon his ruin, but by his own daughter's stubborn refusal to accept a comfortable lie, and by a young man's patient, 21-year determination to see his uncle's name finally cleared. You believe Sir Edmund got off rather more lightly than he deserved, given the severity he himself showed toward others. I believe, Watson, that the law is a rather blunter instrument than the moral weight of any given crime, and that Sir Edmund will likely spend the whole of his remaining years reflecting upon that particular irony from within a cell, rather colder and considerably less comfortable than the ice house he chose to hide in. I find I take a certain grim satisfaction in that irony, whatever its imperfections, as true justice. But I take considerably more satisfaction, if I am honest with you, in the sight of Helena Carrow and Thomas Weathers, 2 young people bound together by a crime neither of them committed, finding some measure of peace with each other rather than perpetuating, across a further generation, the bitterness their father's generation so thoroughly earned. You've grown rather fond of happy endings, Holmes, for a man who so frequently insists he takes no interest in anything beyond the puzzle itself. I have grown, Watson, merely honest about what I have always privately valued, rather than what I generally permit the world to believe I value. Do not, he added, with the ghost of a smile I had come to recognize from our very first case together, all those years before, put that particular observation into print. It would do my reputation for cold reasoning a very great disservice indeed. I have, of course, put it into print regardless, exactly as he knew I would. XXVVB. What justice could not restore, I ought to add, before proceeding to the final and gentler chapter of this account, a word about the practical difficulties Holmes encountered in securing Michael Weathers's posthumous pardon. Difficulties that illustrate, I think, something genuinely important about the limits of even the most thoroughly established truth When it comes to undoing harm, the law itself has already, however wrongly, completed. The law is built, Watson, to prevent future injustice, rather than to undo past injustice already fully executed, Holmes explained to me, during the several months he spent in patient correspondence with the Home Office regarding the Weathers case. A man wrongly imprisoned may be released, his remaining years restored to him, however inadequately, by his eventual freedom. A man wrongly hanged has no such remedy available to him at all. The law can clear his name, certainly, and I do not undervalue the genuine comfort that clearing brings to those who loved him, but it cannot return to him a single day of the life that was taken, nor restore to his widow the husband she buried at merely 20 years of age, nor give back to a child who never lived past her first winter the father she never had the chance to know at all. Then what, precisely, does the pardon accomplish if it cannot undo the fundamental harm? It accomplishes truth, Watson, which is not nothing, however incomplete a remedy it provides. It accomplishes the public acknowledgement that a wrong was done, that an innocent man's name need no longer be spoken with the particular shame a false conviction attaches to it, and that his family's 21 years of quiet, unacknowledged grief was never merely grief for a guilty man's just punishment, but grief for a genuine and terrible injustice. I do not believe truth alone constitutes full justice, Watson, in a case such as this one, but I have come to believe, across a great many cases where full justice proves permanently beyond reach, that truth is very often the only remedy still available to us, and that a detective's proper work, in such cases, is to secure at least that much for the people who have waited so long and so patiently for it. The pardon itself, when it finally came, arrived accompanied by a formal letter from the Home Office acknowledging the grave and regrettable miscarriage of justice that had led to Michael Weathers's execution, and by a small sum of compensation, entirely inadequate to the scale of the loss it purported to address, which Sarah Weathers, in a gesture that moved Holmes considerably more than he generally permitted himself to show, directed in its entirety toward the establishment of a small scholarship fund in her late husband's name, intended to assist young clerks and apprentices of limited means in pursuing further education, that some good, however small, might finally grow from so much wasted grief, as she put it in her own letter of thanks to Holmes, which he kept, I noticed, folded carefully among his most treasured correspondence for the whole of the remaining years I knew him. XXVIII. A year later, I add this final chapter, as I did with the story of the Baker Street lantern, some considerable time after the events I have already set down, for I believe a story of this shape deserves to be followed a little further than its immediate legal conclusion, that you might know how thoroughly the ice that once seemed to swallow a man whole came, in time, to mean something rather gentler to those who remained behind. I returned to Thornfield myself, quite by chance, in the summer of the following year, having been invited to a small garden party Helena had arranged to celebrate the estate's tentative return to something resembling ordinary life. The lake, thawed now into its warmer summer character, lay placid and blue beneath a sky entirely unlike the hard iron grey I remembered from that terrible January, and I found it difficult, standing at its edge with a cup of tea in my hand and the sound of genuine laughter drifting across the lawn behind me, to fully reconcile this gentle scene with the impossible, frightening trail of footprints I had once examined upon its frozen surface. Helena greeted me warmly and introduced me, with a quiet pride I found genuinely moving, to a young man I recognized at once as Thomas Weathers, no longer the shadowy, suspected figure the village had once feared, but a welcome and evidently frequent guest at Thornfield, whose easy manner with Helena herself suggested an attachment that had grown, in the year since their first difficult meeting, into something considerably warmer than mere shared circumstance. "We correspond a great deal," Helena told me, with the particular careful lightness of a woman not yet ready to name a feeling she has nonetheless already fully recognized within herself. "It began, I think, from a shared need to understand something neither of our own families had been honest enough to explain to us properly. It has become, I find, rather more than that. I asked after Sarah Weathers, and learned that she had passed away peacefully that same spring, some months after her grandson's uncle had finally received his posthumous pardon. Passing, Thomas told me, with a contentment he did not believe she would have found possible in any of the 21 years preceding that final vindication. She told me, near the end, that she had spent 2 decades believing she would die without ever seeing justice properly done, he said. "I am glad, more than I can easily express, that I was able to prove her wrong before it was too late." I thought, standing there beside that peaceful summer lake, of Sir Edmund Carrow himself, serving out whatever remained of his own considerably less peaceful years within a prison cell, and I found I could summon very little sympathy for his own particular fate, however much the human complexity of his story had moved me during our investigation. But I found a great deal of quiet satisfaction in the sight of his daughter, standing in the warm summer light beside the very lake that had once nearly destroyed her, building something genuinely hopeful out of the wreckage her father's crimes had left behind. XXVB. The last visit, Thomas told me more, that same afternoon, of the particular manner of Sarah Weathers's final months, and I set it down here because I believe it completes, in its own quiet way, the fuller arc of a grief that had shadowed this whole extraordinary case from its very first mention in Beckett's Tavern Gossip to its final, gentle resolution beside a peaceful summer lake. She asked me, in her last clear-headed week, to take her to see the pardon documents one final time, Thomas said. Not because she doubted their existence, Doctor, but because she wished, I think, to hold the physical proof of it in her own 2 hands one last time before she died. To feel the paper, to see the official seal, to read her husband's name printed there in the formal language of exoneration rather than the informal language of exoneration, rather than the informal language of exoneration, rather than the informal language of exoneration. I brought the documents to her bedside, and she held them for the better part of an hour, saying very little, simply looking at them, and then she told me, quite calmly, that she believed she could rest easy now, having finally seen with her own eyes what she had spent 21 years believing, without ever quite daring to hope she would live to witness. She spoke of your uncle often in those final days. Constantly, Doctor, though never with the particular bitter edge her grief had carried for so many years before. She spoke of him now as a young man remembered with tenderness rather than mourned with anger. His laugh, she told me, had been unusually loud for so slight a man, loud enough that she had always been able to pick it out across a crowded room, and she said she had begun, in those final peaceful months, to hear it again in her memory, without the accompanying grief that had drowned it out for so long. I believe, though I cannot prove it in any way, a detective like Mr. Holmes would accept as evidence, that the pardon did not merely clear my uncle's name in the eyes of the law. It cleared some private space in my grandmother's own heart, long occupied by grief and anger, and allowed something gentler, plain, uncomplicated love, unmixed with injustice, to finally take up residence there instead, for whatever brief remaining time she had left to enjoy it. I have thought often, in the years since, of that image. An old woman dying peacefully at last, holding a formal government document in her two trembling hands, and finding within its dry legal language something that felt, to her, very much like her husband's laugh finally returning to her memory after 21 years of enforced silence. I do not know that Holmes's own careful reasoning, however brilliant in its mechanics, could ever fully account for so purely human a resolution. I believe, in the end, it was never meant to. Holmes's genius lay in uncovering the truth. What people did with that truth, once uncovered, belonged entirely to them, and I have come to believe, reflecting upon this case more than any other in my long career beside him, that this final human alchemy, truth transformed, in time, into something like peace, is very often the truest and most important outcome any investigation can ever hope to produce. A final word on method. I asked Holmes once more, some weeks after that summer visit to Thornfield, to set down for me, plainly, and without his usual impatience for explaining what he considered obvious, the essential method by which he had unravelled the whole affair, for I had resolved by then to set this account before you, and I wished to render his reasoning as faithfully as I could. It is nothing more, at its heart, than the discipline of taking every fact seriously before deciding which facts to discard, Watson, he said, settling into his chair with the particular patience he reserved for questions that touched upon the philosophy rather than merely the mechanics of his profession. A subtle variance in heel depth across a dozen otherwise identical footprints was a fact. A stranger's careful questions about old court cases, followed by his own convenient disappearance, was a fact. A wisp of smoke above a supposedly abandoned ice house was a fact. A valet's unexplained nocturnal errands were a fact. I did nothing more remarkable in the whole of this case than refuse to discard any of these facts simply because no immediate theory yet existed to connect them, holding them all patiently in mind together until the shape they were already forming became visible on its own terms, rather than forcing some premature and comfortable explanation upon them before they were ready to yield their true pattern. And the false suspicion you permitted to fall upon young Weathers, did that too spring from the same patient method, or was it something closer to a calculated risk? It was, I confess, the single element of this case that troubled my own conscience rather more than my usual professional detachment generally permits, Watson, and I do not offer it to you now as an unqualified success of method so much as a difficult and imperfect judgment made under genuine uncertainty that happened to resolve itself favorably in the end. I believed, on the balance of evidence available to me at the time, that a brief period of continued suspicion, permitted to run its course while I completed my own investigation, would ultimately serve young Weathers's own cause more thoroughly than a premature and possibly unconvincing declaration of his innocence, offered before I possessed sufficient proof to make that declaration stick against the full weight of Sir Edmund's own considerable reputation. I believe, in hindsight, that judgment proved correct. I do not know that I would offer the same advice with equal confidence in a case where the stakes, or the uncertainties, ran rather differently. You sound almost troubled by your own success, Holmes. I am troubled, Watson, by any method that requires an innocent man to suffer, however temporarily and however necessarily, in service of a greater truth's eventual emergence. I do not believe such methods are always avoidable in this work, and I do not believe I acted wrongly in this particular instance. given everything I knew and did not yet know at the time. But I would not wish you, in setting down this account for your readers, to portray my reasoning here as some unambiguous triumph of clever strategy, unmarred by any genuine moral cost. Thomas Weathers bore a considerable weight of unjust suspicion for the better part of a month, on my own calculated judgment that bearing it would ultimately serve him better than the alternative. I believe that judgment proved sound. I do not believe it was costless, and I think a detective does his profession a disservice who forgets, even in his moments of greatest triumph, precisely what such judgments actually ask of the people caught within them. I have set his words down here exactly as he spoke them, for I believe they illustrate something essential about Holmes's character that his more celebrated feats of pure deduction do not always fully convey. A genuine and carefully examined conscience, operating quietly beneath the cool, analytical surface the world at large generally associates with him, weighing not merely what method would succeed, but what method would succeed with the least genuine cost to the people whose lives his investigations inevitably touched.
Dissy.
A letter from Holmes I received some further months after that summer visit. A letter from Holmes himself, who had travelled briefly to Hertfordshire on some small unrelated matter, and had, by his own account, called upon Thornfield once more before returning to London. A small courtesy I had not expected of him, given his general reluctance to revisit the scenes of concluded cases without some pressing professional reason to do so. "You will be pleased to learn, Watson," he wrote, "that Miss Carrow and young Weathers have announced their engagement, a development, I confess, I anticipated some months before either of them was willing to admit it openly, even to themselves. I was invited to the small celebration marking the occasion, and found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely moved by the sight of the two families, so bitterly and so tragically connected by Sir Edmund's original crime, now gathered together in evident warmth and mutual affection, Sarah Weathers herself presiding over the tea table with the particular quiet contentment of a woman who has finally, after 21 years, been permitted to see something genuinely good grow from so much accumulated sorrow. I do not generally trouble myself with sentiment in my professional correspondence, as you well know, but I find this particular case has left me with rather more of it than my usual reticence prefers to admit. I have solved cleverer mysteries in my time, Watson, and I dare say I shall solve cleverer ones still before I am through. But I do not know that I have ever witnessed a case whose resolution left behind quite so much genuine hope amid its wreckage, nor one that taught me, so plainly, the particular lesson I believe this whole affair has ultimately illustrated, that truth, however long delayed, however painful its final arrival, very rarely destroys as thoroughly as the comfortable lies it eventually replaces once feared it would. It builds, instead, however slowly and however imperfectly, the only genuine foundation upon which anything lasting can ever properly be constructed. I remain, as ever, your friend and colleague, S.H. I have kept that letter among my own most treasured correspondence in the years since, and I find myself returning to it from time to time, whenever some new case brings us face to face with a piece of buried truth someone would very much prefer remained hidden. A reminder, in Holmes's own careful hand, that the patient, sometimes painful work of uncovering such truths very rarely leaves the world worse for the uncovering, whatever temporary grief or disruption it may cause along the way. And so, my friend, the fire has burned down to embers, and the winter's tale I promised you has run its full course, and it is time, I think, for both of us to rest. There is a particular comfort, I have always found, in mysteries that end not with the darkness of their beginning fully intact, but with some genuine light finally breaking through it. A lake that once seemed to swallow a man whole, revealed in the end to have kept him rather better hidden than dead, and a family's 21 years of grief, finally, however belatedly, given the honest acknowledgement it had always deserved. Sleep well, tonight. Let the cold have the world outside, if it must. Let the ice upon your own mind's lake grow thick and quiet and still, exactly as the ice at Thornfield grows still each winter, waiting patiently, as all true things eventually do, for its own season of thaw. Good night.